Franz Kafka developed one of the most influential and haunting philosophical worldviews in modern literature. Born in 1883 in Prague, he witnessed the collapse of old certainties and the rise of impersonal modern systems. His writings explore the deepest questions about human existence, meaning, and our relationship with authority, truth, and each other. Through stories of transformation, impossible legal systems, and endless bureaucracies, Kafka revealed profound truths about the human condition that remain startlingly relevant today. Part 1. The Absurd Universe. Franz Kafka believed that human existence is fundamentally and irreducibly absurd. This is not simply the idea that life is difficult or unfair, but something much more profound and unsettling. For Kafka, absurdity means that there is no underlying rational order to the universe that human beings can discover or understand. We live in a world that appears to operate according to rules and systems, but these are ultimately meaningless and arbitrary. Kafka thought that the whole human race was the product of one of God's bad days. This striking image captures his belief that existence itself is a cosmic mistake or accident. Unlike philosophers who try to find meaning in suffering or create systematic explanations for life's difficulties, Kafka insisted that meaninglessness is the basic truth of existence. There is no hidden purpose waiting to be discovered, no grand plan that makes sense of our struggles, no ultimate justice that will set things right. This creates what Kafka saw as the central paradox of human life. We are creatures who desperately need meaning and purpose, yet we find ourselves thrown into a universe that offers neither. We cannot stop ourselves from searching for explanations, seeking patterns, hoping for resolution, even though reason tells us that none of these things exist. This is not a temporary condition that we might overcome through wisdom or spiritual growth, but the permanent state of being human. The absurd manifests itself in every aspect of daily life. We follow routines that serve no ultimate purpose, participate in institutions whose goals we do not understand, and submit to authorities whose legitimacy we cannot verify. We wake up each morning and perform the same meaningless tasks, telling ourselves stories about progress and achievement to mask the underlying futility. Kafka saw through these comforting illusions to the raw absurdity beneath. In his stories, this philosophical insight takes concrete form through impossible situations that defy logical explanation. A travelling salesman wakes up one morning to find himself transformed into a giant insect with no explanation offered for this bizarre change. A bank clerk is arrested for an unspecified crime by officials who refuse to tell him what he has done wrong or how he might defend himself. A land surveyor arrives at a village to begin work at a castle, but can never actually reach his destination or speak to anyone in authority. These events are not allegories or symbols that point to some deeper meaning. They are literal presentations of the absurd nature of existence itself. Kafka refused to provide explanations or resolutions because he believed that the demand for explanation is itself part of the human problem. We want the universe to make sense, but it does not, and our insistence that it should only increases our suffering and confusion. The absurd is not something that happens to us occasionally during moments of crisis or tragedy. It is the fundamental structure of reality, present in every moment of ordinary life. When we go to work, follow laws, maintain relationships, or pursue goals, we are participating in systems that have no ultimate justification or purpose. The fact that these activities seem normal and necessary does not make them any less absurd, It only shows how thoroughly we have learned to ignore the underlying meaninglessness. Kafka understood that most people cannot bear to live with full awareness of the absurd. We create elaborate mental defenses to protect ourselves from this knowledge, telling ourselves that our work matters, that progress is real, that justice will ultimately prevail. These beliefs are not true, but they allow us to function without being paralyzed by despair. However, Kafka argued that living in denial of the absurd is a form of bad faith that diminishes our humanity and makes us complicit in systems of oppression and meaninglessness. The recognition of absurdity does not lead to nihilism or the abandonment of all values. Instead, it requires a different kind of courage and a different way of living. When we accept that the universe provides no ultimate meaning or purpose, we must take full responsibility for creating whatever meaning our lives will have. This responsibility is both terrifying and liberating because it means that every choice we make matters precisely because there is no external authority to justify or condemn our decisions. Kafka's vision of the absurd universe is deeply connected to his experience of modernity. He lived through the collapse of traditional religious and social certainties that had given previous generations a sense of cosmic order and purpose. The rise of industrialization, bureaucracy, and mass society created new forms of alienation and meaninglessness that earlier philosophers had not anticipated. Kafka was among the first to recognize that these changes were not temporary growing pains, but permanent features of modern existence. The absurd also reveals itself in the gap between human aspirations and human limitations. We desire absolute knowledge, perfect justice, complete understanding and eternal meaning, but we are finite creatures trapped in particular circumstances with limited perspectives. This mismatch between what we want and what is possible creates an ongoing sense of frustration and disappointment that no amount of achievement can resolve. We are always reaching for something beyond our grasp, and the effort to grasp it only emphasizes our inadequacy. Part 2. Existential Responsibility and Freedom. Kafka remained fascinated and overwhelmed by what he saw as the central dilemma of human existence, the difficulty of responsible commitment in the face of an absurd universe. This paradox lies at the heart of his philosophical vision. Even though the world has no inherent meaning or divine guidance, we cannot escape the burden of making choices and taking responsibility for our actions. We are condemned to be free, as later existentialists would say, forced to create our own values in a universe that provides no moral compass. Deprived of all metaphysical guidelines, human beings are nevertheless obligated to act morally in a world where death renders everything meaningless. This creates an almost unbearable tension in human consciousness. We know that our choices ultimately do not matter in any cosmic sense, yet we cannot avoid feeling that they matter desperately in terms of our own integrity and humanity. Every decision becomes a test of character, even when we have no reliable way to determine what constitutes good character. Kafka explored this theme through characters who must navigate impossible situations without clear moral guidance. His protagonists cannot rely on traditional authorities, religious teachings, or social conventions to tell them what to do. They are thrown into circumstances that demand immediate action, yet every possible course of action seems inadequate or wrong. This reflects the modern condition of having to make moral choices without access to absolute moral truths. The weight of this responsibility creates what philosophers call existential anxiety. It is not the fear of any particular outcome, but the deeper dread that comes from recognizing the full burden of human freedom. When we understand that we are completely responsible for who we become, the comfortable illusion of being victims of circumstance disappears. We can no longer blame our parents, our society, our genes, or our circumstances for the choices we make and the person we become. This responsibility extends beyond our actions to our very being. Kafka believed that humans make themselves what they are through their own choices, not just their dramatic decisions, but their daily habits and small compromises. Every moment of cowardice or courage, every act of kindness or cruelty, every choice to engage with life or withdraw from it shapes who we become. We are constantly creating ourselves through our responses to the situations we encounter. The burden becomes even heavier when we realize that our choices affect not only ourselves, but others. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor makes himself who he is based on his own choices to alienate himself from his family, devote his life to a job he hates, and act in such a selfless way as to not care for himself. His transformation into an insect represents the logical endpoint of these choices, but it also reveals how his family has been shaped by his decisions to sacrifice himself for their comfort. Responsibility is relational, extending outward in ways we cannot always foresee or control. Kafka rejected the idea that ignorance excuses us from moral responsibility. His characters often act without full knowledge of the consequences or even the nature of their situation, but this does not reduce their accountability. In the trial, Joseph K. never learns what crime he is accused of, yet he remains responsible for how he responds to his predicament. The fact that the system is absurd and unjust does not exempt him from the obligation to maintain his dignity and integrity within it. Freedom in Kafka's world is not the liberal notion of being able to do whatever we want without interference. It is the more fundamental and frightening freedom of being completely responsible for our existence without any ultimate justification for our choices. This freedom cannot be escaped through conformity, rebellion or withdrawal because it is built into the structure of human consciousness. Even the choice not to choose is itself a choice for which we must take responsibility. The existential dimension of responsibility also means that we cannot delegate our moral agency to others. We cannot say that we were just following orders, just doing our job, just conforming to social expectations. Every act of compliance or resistance reflects our fundamental choice about what kind of person we want to be. Kafka shows us characters who try to escape this burden by losing themselves in bureaucratic roles or family obligations, but they only succeed in diminishing their humanity. This responsibility extends to our relationship with truth and meaning. Since the universe provides no ready-made answers, we must take responsibility for seeking truth and creating meaning, even knowing that our efforts may be futile. The choice to stop searching, to accept comfortable lies, or to embrace cynical despair is a moral choice that reflects our character. Kafka suggests that the search itself has value, regardless of whether it leads to any final answers. The burden of existential responsibility is made more complex by the fact that we must act without certainty. We can never know for sure whether our choices are right or wrong, whether our values are valid, or whether our actions will lead to the outcomes we intend. Yet we cannot use this uncertainty as an excuse for inaction or moral relativism. We must choose and act based on our best understanding of the situation, knowing that we may be wrong, but accepting full responsibility for the consequences. Part 3. Alienation and Isolation. The source of Kafka's deepest despair lies in a sense of ultimate isolation from true communion with all human beings and with any transcendent reality. This is not the temporary loneliness that comes from being alone or misunderstood, but a fundamental alienation that seems built into the human condition itself. Kafka's characters feel cut off from meaningful connection with family, friends, society, and even themselves. This isolation is not accidental or temporary, but appears to be an inescapable feature of modern existence. Alienation manifests first in the breakdown of family relationships. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor's transformation into an insect represents the extreme endpoint of a process that was already underway before his physical change. Even as a human being, he was already alienated from his family by his role as breadwinner, unable to pursue his own dreams or connect authentically with those closest to him. His transformation makes visible the isolation that was always present but hidden beneath the surface of normal family life. The physical transformation serves as a powerful metaphor for the inner experience of feeling like an outsider in your own life. Gregor's change into an insect symbolizes his inner feelings of worthlessness and detachment from human society. But the metaphor works both ways, suggesting that his family's inability to see him as fully human predated his transformation. They valued him primarily for his economic contribution, not for his inner life or individual worth. This alienation extends beyond personal relationships to encompass the individual's relationship with society as a whole. Most of Kafka's characters have removed themselves from their communities as they come to accept the absurdity of existence and attempt to live with this awareness. They recognize that social conventions and shared beliefs are often meaningless, but this knowledge only increases their sense of isolation. The price of seeing clearly is loneliness and disconnection from those who still believe in comforting illusions. Work becomes another site of alienation rather than meaningful engagement with the world. Kafka's protagonists typically hold jobs that feel mechanical and purposeless, contributing to systems they do not understand or believe in. Gregor works as a travelling salesman, a job he hates but cannot escape because of his family's financial dependence on him. Joseph K. works at a bank, performing tasks that seem disconnected from any larger purpose or meaning. This workplace alienation reflects a broader feature of modern industrial society. People become cogs in vast machines that operate according to their own logic, serving purposes that individual workers cannot comprehend or influence. The specialization and bureaucratization of modern life means that most people spend their days performing narrow tasks that contribute to outcomes they never see. Work becomes a form of alienated labor that drains life energy without providing genuine satisfaction or meaning. The alienation also has a temporal dimension, involving disconnection from both past and future. Kafka's characters seem cut off from any sense of historical continuity or traditional wisdom that might guide their choices. They cannot rely on the lessons of previous generations because the world has changed too rapidly and fundamentally. At the same time, they struggle to imagine meaningful futures because the direction of change seems beyond anyone's control or understanding. Language itself becomes a source of alienation rather than connection. Characters in Kafka's stories often find that words fail to convey their true meaning, or that others consistently misunderstand their attempts at communication. The tools we use to reach out to others become barriers that reinforce our isolation. Even when people use the same words, they may mean completely different things, leading to conversations that create more confusion than clarity. Geographic and cultural displacement intensifies the experience of alienation. Kafka wrote as a German-speaking Jew living in Prague, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, experiencing multiple forms of marginality simultaneously. His characters often find themselves in foreign or unfamiliar environments where they do not understand the rules or customs. This displacement serves as a metaphor for the broader modern experience of feeling like strangers in our own world. The alienation from others is matched by an equally profound alienation from the self. Characters struggle to understand their own motivations, feelings, and desires. They feel like strangers to themselves, unable to achieve the self-knowledge that might provide some foundation for authentic living. This internal alienation makes it even more difficult to form genuine connections with others, creating a vicious cycle of isolation and self-estrangement. Perhaps most troubling is the alienation from any sense of ultimate meaning or transcendent reality. Kafka's characters live in a world where traditional sources of meaning have disappeared or become inaccessible. God remains either absent or so distant as to be irrelevant to human concerns. Nature provides no comfort or guidance. Society offers only arbitrary rules and meaningless procedures. This leaves individuals completely on their own, without any larger framework to give significance to their struggles and choices. Yet Kafka suggests that the recognition of alienation may be the beginning of a different kind of authenticity. When we stop pretending that we are not alone, when we acknowledge the fundamental isolation of human existence, we may be able to relate to others and ourselves more honestly. The attempt to overcome alienation through false connections or comforting illusions only deepens our estrangement. Accepting alienation as a basic condition of human existence may paradoxically open up possibilities for more genuine forms of relationship and meaning. Part 4. Bureaucracy and Authority. At the heart of Kafka's most obsessive and horrifying narratives lies an unfathomable bureaucracy, one that has emerged through a combination of inertia, default, and the institution of political power. These systems perpetuate themselves by feeding upon the rights of the people they were ostensibly designed to serve. Kafka understood with remarkable prescience that modern life would be dominated by vast, impersonal institutions that claim to serve human needs but actually control and diminish human possibilities. His vision of bureaucratic power has become even more relevant as these systems have grown larger and more complex in the centuries since his death. The shackles of suffering humanity are made up of official papers, documents passed hand to hand between legions of officials who are often anonymous and insignificant individually. Yet their power is enhanced through dumb submission to the bureaucratic machine that gives them authority. These papers grow exponentially and become the means by which governing bodies exercise their power over individual lives. The modern bureaucratic state is based upon written documents that are preserved in their original or duplicate form, creating permanent records that can be used to track and control citizens. Kafka's officials are organized in ranks or legions, from the most powerful who remain truly unreachable to the most subservient, who are nonetheless dangerous in their own way. This hierarchical structure resembles the angels and demons in religious cosmologies, with each level having authority over those below while remaining subject to those above. But unlike religious hierarchies that supposedly serve divine purposes, bureaucratic hierarchies serve only themselves. No official knows the identity of his superior, limiting his own authority to executing orders from higher up the ladder without understanding their ultimate purpose or justification. The genius of modern bureaucratic power lies in its ability to diffuse responsibility throughout the system. When something goes wrong, no individual can be held accountable because everyone was simply following procedures established by someone else. The system operates according to its own internal logic, which may have little connection to the actual needs or welfare of the people it supposedly serves. Decisions are made by no one in particular, yet affect everyone, creating a situation where power exists without accountability. Bureaucracies thrive on meaningless work, creating layers of inefficiency that actually serve to erode individual autonomy while reinforcing institutional authority. The multiplication of procedures, forms and regulations creates the appearance of rational administration while actually making effective action more difficult. People become trapped in endless loops of documentation and approval processes that serve no clear purpose except to maintain the system itself. The bureaucracy becomes an end in itself rather than a means to any external goal. This creates what researchers have identified as three major characteristics of bureaucratic experience: inactiveness, helplessness, and meaninglessness. Inactiveness refers to the way bureaucratic procedures discourage initiative and creativity, requiring people to wait for permission and follow predetermined steps. Helplessness emerges from the realization that individual agency has little impact on bureaucratic outcomes, which seem to follow their own mysterious logic. Meaninglessness develops when people lose sight of any larger purpose served by the bureaucratic activities they must perform or endure. The trial presents the most systematic exploration of bureaucratic authority in Kafka's work. Joseph K. finds himself subject to a legal system that operates in complete secrecy, following rules that no one will explain to him. He cannot discover what crime he's accused of, what evidence exists against him, or what procedures he must follow to defend himself. Yet the system has complete power over his life, able to investigate him, restrict his movements, and ultimately execute him without ever providing any justification for its actions. The court in the trial represents the ultimate bureaucratic nightmare, a system of power that claims to serve justice but actually serves only itself. The proceedings gradually merge into the judgment, meaning that the process of being investigated becomes equivalent to being found guilty. The system cannot tolerate the possibility that it might be wrong, so it interprets any resistance or questioning as evidence of guilt. This creates a perfect closed loop where the system can never be challenged or reformed from within. Kafka shows how bureaucratic systems reshape the personalities and worldviews of the people who work within them. Officials become invested in the procedures and hierarchies that give them whatever power they possess. They lose sight of any purposes beyond the maintenance of the system itself. Even relatively low-level functionaries develop a stake in preserving the complexity and inscrutability that make their specialized knowledge valuable. The psychological effects of bureaucratic power extend far beyond the workplace. People internalize bureaucratic ways of thinking and relating, becoming more passive, rule-oriented and risk-averse in all areas of their lives. They learn to see themselves as cases to be processed rather than individuals with unique needs and circumstances. The bureaucratic mindset spreads throughout society, affecting family relationships, education, healthcare, and every other domain of human experience. Yet Kafka also suggests that bureaucratic power reveals its own fragility. The whole elaborate system depends on people's willingness to submit to its authority and follow its procedures. The servant girl Pepi tells Kay that to free himself from the domination of the lords of the castle, it would be enough to set fire to the whole structure and burn it down like a piece of paper in the stove. Paper burns quickly and leaves little behind, making all duties, obligations and procedures disappear in a blaze. This insight points toward a deeper truth about all forms of bureaucratic authority. Never has power been so oppressive and pervasive, but never before has power so revealed its own fragility. The elaborate machinery of control depends ultimately on the cooperation of those it seeks to control. When people refuse to participate in meaningless procedures or submit to arbitrary authority, the whole system begins to lose its grip on reality. Part 5. Guilt and Shame. A prominent theme throughout Kafka's work is the father-son conflict and the guilt induced in the son that seeks resolution through suffering and atonement. But Kafka's exploration of guilt extends far beyond family relationships to encompass what he saw as a fundamental feature of human consciousness itself. His characters often feel guilty without knowing why, or feel responsible for things completely beyond their control. This reflects Kafka's belief that guilt is not primarily about specific wrongdoing, but about the basic condition of being human in an incomprehensible and often hostile world. The guilt experienced by Kafka's protagonists is typically disproportionate to any actual wrongdoing on their part. In the trial, Joseph K's frequent awareness of his guilt is not a sign of the court's justice, but a symptom of his psychological manipulation by the ruthless organization that has badgered him into submission. The legal system does not seek to determine actual guilt or innocence, but to make the accused feel guilty regardless of what they have done. This shows how authority can manipulate our sense of right and wrong, making us complicit in our own oppression by convincing us that we deserve whatever treatment we receive. Kafka understood that modern systems of power operate largely through the internalization of guilt rather than external coercion. When people believe they are fundamentally flawed or unworthy, they police themselves more effectively than any external authority could. They accept limitations on their freedom, submit to arbitrary rules, and endure unjust treatment because they have been convinced that they deserve no better. This psychological manipulation is more effective than physical force because it enlists the victims as active participants in their own subjugation. The sense of guilt also manifests through the endless options that humans have to choose from when making decisions in a world without clear moral guidelines. Every choice carries the weight of possible wrongness, and the multiplication of choices increases rather than decreases our anxiety about making the right decision. Characters struggle with their inability to commit, along with their difficulties distinguishing good from evil, which causes them never to be able to settle or feel grounded. Freedom itself becomes a burden when we cannot be certain that our choices are morally justified or will lead to good outcomes. Kafka's treatment of guilt is closely connected to his understanding of shame as a social emotion. While guilt focuses on specific actions we have taken or failed to take, shame involves our fundamental sense of self-worth and belonging. Characters in Kafka's stories often feel ashamed of their very existence, as if their presence in the world is somehow inappropriate or unwelcome. This existential shame cannot be resolved through confession, punishment, or atonement, because it is not based on anything the person has actually done wrong. The Metamorphosis provides the most vivid exploration of shame in Kafka's work. Gregor's transformation into an insect makes literal the feeling of being disgusting and unacceptable that many people carry as a hidden burden. His family's rejection of him mirrors the social exclusion that Kafka felt as a Jew in a predominantly Christian society. The insect form represents how marginalized people are made to feel about themselves, not just different but fundamentally repulsive and threatening to normal social order. The covering of shame becomes a central preoccupation for Kafka's characters. Gregor covers himself with a sheet to shield his family from his ghastly sight, an action that reveals both his consideration for others and his internalization of their revulsion. This gesture embodies the pathetic attempt to maintain dignity while accepting the judgment that one is fundamentally shameful. The tragedy lies not in the transformation itself, but in Gregor's acceptance of his family's assessment that he has become something horrible. Kafka shows how guilt and shame can be transmitted across generations and embedded in cultural patterns. The father-son conflicts in his stories often involve the son's inability to escape the emotional patterns established by previous generations. Sons feel guilty for disappointing fathers who themselves felt guilty for disappointing their own fathers, creating cycles of inadequacy and resentment that seem impossible to break. These patterns become so deeply ingrained that they feel natural and inevitable rather than learned and changeable. The institutional production of guilt reaches its most systematic form in Kafka's depiction of legal and religious systems. These institutions claim to uphold justice and morality, but actually function to create and maintain feelings of unworthiness in the populations they control. They establish impossible standards of behavior, interpret human weakness as moral failure, and offer redemption only through submission to their authority. The cure they offer for guilt only creates more guilt, ensuring a steady supply of penitents seeking forgiveness for sins they may never have committed. Yet Kafka also suggests that the excessive nature of this guilt reveals its artificial character. When guilt becomes completely disproportionate to any actual wrongdoing, it becomes possible to recognize it as a form of social control rather than legitimate moral response. The very extremity of Joseph K.'s situation in the trial makes visible the absurdity of all guilt that is not based on genuine moral reflection and personal responsibility. When we see how guilt can be manufactured and manipulated, we begin to distinguish between authentic moral feeling and socially imposed shame. The resolution of guilt in Kafka's work rarely comes through traditional forms of atonement or forgiveness. Instead, characters must learn to distinguish between guilt that serves a legitimate moral purpose and guilt that serves only to diminish their humanity. This requires developing what we might call moral courage, the ability to trust one's own judgment about right and wrong rather than deferring automatically to external authorities. True moral responsibility begins with the rejection of false guilt and the acceptance of genuine accountability for our choices and their consequences. The theme of guilt in Kafka's work ultimately points toward questions about the nature of moral agency and personal responsibility. In a world where traditional moral authorities have lost their credibility, individuals must develop their own capacity for ethical judgment. This means neither accepting guilt for everything that goes wrong, nor rejecting all responsibility for our actions and their effects on others. The goal is not to eliminate guilt entirely, but to ensure that it serves genuine moral purposes, rather than functioning as a tool of social control and personal diminishment. Part 6. Transformation and Metamorphosis. Transformation serves as one of the most prominent themes and archetypes in Kafka's work, representing the sudden and often inexplicable changes that define human existence. These transformations are usually physical, dramatic, and irreversible, reflecting how life can change fundamentally without warning, explanation, or the possibility of return to previous conditions. Kafka used transformation as a powerful symbol for the psychological and spiritual changes that occur throughout human life, often against our will and beyond our understanding. We wake up one day to find that everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our world has shifted in ways we cannot comprehend or control. The most famous example appears in the Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa awakens to find himself transformed into a giant insect. This change occurs without explanation or precedent, forcing both Gregor and his family to confront who they really are beneath their social roles and expectations. The transformation reveals that Gregor was already alienated from his family and himself long before his physical change, working at a job he hated to support people who valued him primarily for his economic contribution. His metamorphosis makes visible the dehumanization that was already present in his relationships and daily life. Kafka suggests that all human beings undergo constant transformation, though usually in ways too gradual or subtle to notice. We are always becoming different people through our choices, experiences, and responses to circumstances beyond our control. The dramatic physical transformations in his stories serve as metaphors for these ongoing psychological and moral changes that shape who we become over time. Every significant experience transforms us in some way, leaving us slightly different people than we were before, though we may not recognize the change until much later. The transformations in Kafka's work often reveal the arbitrary and fragile nature of human identity. We like to think of ourselves as stable, consistent personalities with fixed characteristics and values. But Kafka shows how quickly and completely this sense of stable selfhood can collapse when circumstances change dramatically. The businessman can become an insect, the free citizen can become a prisoner, the confident individual can become lost and confused in systems beyond their comprehension. These changes force characters to question everything they previously took for granted about themselves and their world. When Gregor becomes an insect, he must reconsider his relationship with his family, his work, his physical needs, and his place in the social order. The transformation strips away all the familiar structures that previously gave his life meaning and purpose. This radical disorientation opens up both terrifying possibilities of complete meaninglessness and liberating opportunities for authentic self-discovery. Kafka explores how transformation affects not only the individual who changes, but everyone in their orbit. Gregor's metamorphosis forces his family members to confront their own dependencies, assumptions, and moral character in ways they never had to before. His sister Greta undergoes her own transformation from dependent child to responsible adult, blooming into womanhood partly as a result of the crisis created by Gregor's change. The father transforms from a weak and passive figure into someone who takes charge of the household, while the mother must choose between loyalty to her son and loyalty to the rest of the family. The novel exposes the inherent flaws of a system that values productivity and efficiency over human well-being and authentic relationships. When Gregor can no longer work and contribute financially to the household, his family quickly begins to see him as a burden rather than a beloved family member. This reveals that their love was conditional on his economic usefulness, highlighting how capitalist values penetrate even the most intimate relationships. The transformation makes visible the dehumanizing effects of treating people primarily as economic units rather than individuals with intrinsic worth. Transformation in Kafka's work is not always purely negative or destructive. It can also represent the possibility of breaking free from oppressive circumstances or discovering new aspects of ourselves that were previously hidden or suppressed. The sisters' Metamorphosis contrasts starkly with Gregor's Decline, showing how the same crisis can lead to growth and empowerment for some while causing deterioration for others. Her transformation suggests that change, even when triggered by tragedy, can open up new possibilities for self-realization and independence. The theme of transformation also connects to Kafka's understanding of the creative process and the role of art in human life. Writing was for Kafka a form of personal transformation, a way of exploring different possibilities of selfhood and meaning. The act of creation involves becoming temporarily someone else, seeing the world through different eyes, and discovering aspects of experience that normal consciousness overlooks. Art transforms both the creator and the audience, opening up new ways of understanding and relating to reality. Kafka's transformations often involve a movement between human and animal states, suggesting questions about what makes us fundamentally human. When Gregor becomes an insect, he retains his human consciousness and emotional capacity while losing his human physical form and social position. This raises profound questions about whether our humanity lies in our bodies, our minds, our relationships, or our capacity for moral choice. The transformation forces us to consider what aspects of human identity are essential and which are merely accidental features of our current circumstances. The irreversible nature of most transformations in Kafka's work reflects his understanding that significant life changes cannot simply be undone. We cannot return to innocence after gaining knowledge, to youth after aging, to ignorance after awareness. Each major transformation marks a permanent crossing from one state of being to another, requiring us to integrate the new reality into our sense of ourselves. The attempt to deny or reverse these changes leads only to further alienation and suffering. Ultimately, Kafka suggests that transformation is not something that happens to us occasionally, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. We are always in the process of becoming something different, always poised between what we have been and what we might become. The recognition of this constant transformation can be either terrifying or liberating, depending on whether we try to resist it or learn to embrace it as an essential aspect of being human. The goal is not to avoid change, but to maintain our dignity and authenticity through whatever transformations life brings our way. Part 7. The Impossibility of Truth and Knowledge. Kafka believed that truth is fundamentally inaccessible to human beings, not because we lack intelligence or effort, but because truth itself may not exist in any form we can comprehend or utilize. His characters constantly seek understanding and clarity about their situations, but they are always frustrated in these attempts. The more they investigate, question, and analyze, the more confused and uncertain they become. This reflects Kafka's conviction that the human quest for knowledge is itself problematic, based on assumptions about reality that may be completely false. In the law, lies are made into a universal system, as Kafka wrote in The Trial. This does not mean simply that legal systems are corrupt, though they often are, but that the very attempt to institutionalize truth creates systematic distortions of reality. When human institutions claim to possess or dispense truth, they inevitably transform truth into something else: propaganda, ideology, or administrative convenience. The institutional need for clarity, consistency and control conflicts with the complexity, ambiguity and changeability that characterize actual human experience. Kafka demonstrated this theme through narrative techniques that withhold crucial information from both protagonists and readers. By denying knowledge to characters and audience alike, he dangles the promise that all will be revealed in the end while making it increasingly clear that no revelation is forthcoming. This technique mirrors the broader human condition of seeking answers that may not exist, hoping for explanations that will never come, expecting resolution to mysteries that have no solution. The frustration we feel as readers reflects the frustration of being human in a world that refuses to explain itself. The impossibility of truth manifests most clearly in communication between characters. Language, which should serve as a tool for sharing understanding and creating connection, becomes instead a source of misunderstanding and isolation. Characters speak past each other, misinterpret crucial information, and find that their words fail to convey their intended meanings. Even when people use the same words, they often mean completely different things, leading to conversations that create more confusion than clarity. This breakdown of communication reflects deeper problems with language itself as a means of accessing or expressing truth. Words are always inadequate to capture the full complexity of experience, emotion, or thought. They carry different associations and connotations for different people based on their backgrounds, experiences, and contexts. The attempt to translate inner experience into public language necessarily involves distortion, simplification, and loss of meaning that cannot be avoided or corrected. Technology, which promises to improve communication and increase access to information, actually compounds these problems in Kafka's vision. The telephone can be interpreted as a vehicle of communication that implies false and distant presence, creating the illusion of contact while maintaining actual separation. Modern communication technologies multiply opportunities for misunderstanding while creating expectations of clarity and immediacy that cannot be fulfilled. The more sophisticated our communication tools become, the more obvious becomes the fundamental impossibility of truly understanding or being understood by another person. Kafka's approach to truth reflects his broader skepticism about human reason and its capacity to comprehend reality. The Enlightenment promise that rational investigation would eventually reveal the true nature of things struck Kafka as fundamentally naive. Reason itself may be merely another human creation, no more reliable than emotion or intuition as a guide to understanding the world. The scientific method, logical analysis and systematic investigation may produce useful results for practical purposes, but they cannot penetrate to ultimate truth about the nature of existence. This epistemological skepticism extends to moral and political truths as well as factual ones. Characters in Kafka's stories struggle to distinguish between right and wrong, justice and injustice, legitimate and illegitimate authority. The criteria they might use to make these distinctions are themselves questionable, based on assumptions they cannot verify and traditions they have inherited rather than chosen. Moral judgment requires some foundation of shared values and common understanding, but these foundations appear to be arbitrary constructions rather than discoveries of objective truth. The quest for self-knowledge proves equally futile in Kafka's world. Characters cannot achieve reliable understanding of their own motivations, desires, or true nature. They remain mysteries to themselves, acting for reasons they cannot explain and pursuing goals they cannot clearly articulate. This internal opacity makes it even more difficult to achieve understanding with others, since we cannot share what we do not ourselves possess. Yet Kafka suggests that the impossibility of truth does not necessarily lead to nihilism or despair. The recognition that we cannot achieve final answers may liberate us from the oppressive demand to have all the answers before we can act. When we accept that uncertainty is the permanent human condition, we may be able to live more honestly and authentically within that uncertainty. The goal shifts from achieving truth to maintaining integrity in the face of inevitable ignorance and confusion. This perspective also opens up space for different ways of relating to knowledge and understanding. Instead of seeking final answers, we might focus on asking better questions. Instead of demanding certainty, we might develop comfort with ambiguity and provisional conclusions. Instead of expecting truth to be revealed to us, we might take responsibility for creating whatever meaning and understanding our lives will have. The impossibility of truth in Kafka's work ultimately points toward questions about how we should live when we cannot know for certain what we should do. This requires developing qualities like humility, tolerance for uncertainty, and willingness to act without complete knowledge. It also requires distinguishing between the kinds of knowledge that matter for practical purposes and the ultimate truths that may forever remain beyond human reach. The search for truth may be valuable not because it succeeds, but because it keeps us engaged with the complexity and mystery of existence. Part 8. Justice versus Law. The central conflict in the trial, and much of Kafka's other work, involves the struggle between the ideal of justice and the reality of legal systems. Kafka drew a sharp and crucial distinction between these two concepts that are often confused or conflated in ordinary thinking. Justice represents the human aspiration for fairness, truth, and moral order, while law represents the institutional attempt to codify and enforce these ideals through human organizations. The tragedy lies in the inevitable corruption that occurs when transcendent ideals are translated into mundane bureaucratic procedures. The lofty and unattainable goal of absolute justice becomes muddled by worldly attempts to enforce it through human institutions. The human impulse to institutionalize the concept of justice has created corrupt and actively counterproductive judicial systems that perpetrate injustice in the name of justice. This is not simply a matter of particular legal systems being poorly designed or administered, but a fundamental problem with the very attempt to embody perfect justice in imperfect human institutions. The institutional need for consistency, efficiency, and control conflicts with the individual attention and nuanced judgment that genuine justice requires. In the trial, Joseph K. receives treatment that violates every principle of what most people would consider a fair legal process. He is never informed of the specific charges against him, forbidden from learning essential details of his case, denied access to effective legal representation, and eventually executed without any deeper understanding of how his conviction was reached. Yet the system repeatedly assures him that whatever treatment he receives will be just treatment because the system itself has become the arbiter of what constitutes justice. The system conceives of itself as naturally just, and therefore considers anything it does to be automatically justified. This creates a perfect closed loop, where the legal system cannot be criticized or reformed because it has defined justice as whatever it chooses to do. Any resistance or questioning is interpreted as evidence of guilt, and any suffering inflicted is seen as deserved punishment. The proceedings gradually merge into the judgment, meaning that the process of being investigated becomes equivalent to being found guilty. The system cannot tolerate the possibility that it might be wrong, because that would undermine its claim to represent justice itself. Kafka brings to the forefront themes of frustration and helplessness while dealing with a corrupt, incomprehensible, and unjust justice system that seems designed to stifle rather than serve the people it claims to protect. The legal bureaucracy operates according to secret rules that no ordinary person can understand or influence. Officials have vast discretionary power, but no accountability for how they use it. Procedures multiply endlessly without serving any clear purpose except to maintain the authority of those who administer them. The contrast between justice and law also reflects broader tensions between ideal and reality that run throughout human experience. We aspire to perfect fairness, but must settle for rough approximations administered by flawed human beings. We want clear rules that apply equally to everyone, but we also want individual circumstances to be taken into account. We seek consistency and predictability, but we also value mercy and the possibility of redemption. These tensions become acute in complex modern societies, where legal systems must deal with millions of cases involving people from different backgrounds with conflicting interests and values. The attempt to create universal rules inevitably involves generalizations that do injustice to particular situations. The need for efficiency and administrative convenience conflicts with the time and attention that careful moral judgment requires. The pressure to appear impartial and objective may actually prevent legal officials from exercising the human sympathy and understanding that justice demands. Kafka's critique extends beyond formal legal systems to encompass all attempts to institutionalize moral judgment. Religious organizations, educational institutions, business corporations and government agencies all claim to serve higher purposes while often functioning primarily to preserve their own power and authority. They develop internal logics that may have little connection to their stated missions or the needs of the people they supposedly serve. The institutional imperative to survive and grow can override any commitment to the values that originally justified the institution's existence. Yet Kafka does not suggest that we can do without legal systems or other institutions entirely. The alternative to imperfect institutional justice is not perfect individual justice, but chaos, violence, and the arbitrary exercise of power by whoever happens to be strongest at any given moment. Human beings need some framework of shared rules and procedures to coordinate their activities and resolve conflicts. The challenge is to maintain awareness of the gap between institutional procedures and genuine justice, so that we can work to minimize the inevitable distortions and corruptions. This requires developing what we might call institutional humility, the recognition that no human organization can perfectly embody the ideals it claims to serve. Legal systems should be judged not by whether they achieve perfect justice, but by whether they do better than the available alternatives and whether they remain open to criticism and reform. The danger comes when institutions begin to confuse themselves with the ideals they were created to serve, claiming infallibility and demanding uncritical obedience. When law becomes identical with justice in the minds of those who administer it, the possibility of genuine justice disappears. The theme of justice versus law ultimately points toward questions about how individuals should relate to the institutional structures that govern their lives. We cannot simply reject all institutional authority without losing the benefits of social cooperation and coordination. But we also cannot accept institutional authority uncritically without becoming complicit in whatever injustices these institutions perpetrate. The goal is to maintain enough independence of judgment to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate exercises of institutional power while working within existing systems to promote genuine justice whenever possible. Part 9. Religious Themes and Negative Theology. Everyone familiar with Kafka criticism knows the basic religious motifs that permeate his work: guilt, redemption, grace, transcendence, absolute might, and sacrifice. These are categories that cannot be discussed outside the bounds of religious discourse, yet Kafka's treatment of them is deeply unconventional and often disturbing. His relationship with religion is complicated and frequently negative, exploring what happens to religious consciousness when traditional beliefs become impossible to maintain. Rather than offering comfort or hope, Kafka's religious themes often intensify the anxiety and alienation experienced by his characters. Some critics see Kafka's work as allegorical, representing a quest that is metaphysical in nature and directed toward God. But this is a God who remains forever absent and unreachable, more notable for what is not revealed than for any positive presence or communication. Kafka explores what theologians call negative theology, the idea that we can only approach the divine by acknowledging what it is not and what we cannot know about it. This leads to a form of religious consciousness that is defined by longing, uncertainty, and perpetual seeking rather than by faith, knowledge, or spiritual satisfaction. The infinite distance between human beings and any transcendent reality takes on the meaning of inaccessibility, and this inaccessibility paradoxically becomes a form of divine transcendence. God's absence becomes a kind of presence, God's silence becomes a form of communication, and God's hiddenness becomes a revelation of the limits of human understanding. This creates a peculiar form of faith that is sustained by doubt rather than certainty, by questions rather than answers. The inability to reach God becomes itself a form of religious experience, though one that provides no comfort or guidance for practical life. Kafka desired to extinguish his self through writing, and he explicitly described writing as a form of prayer. This suggests that his literary work functioned as a spiritual practice, even though it led not to traditional religious revelation, but to deeper mystery and uncertainty. The act of creation becomes a way of approaching the sacred, but the sacred remains fundamentally unknowable and unreachable. Art becomes a substitute for religion, while simultaneously revealing the inadequacy of all human attempts to connect with transcendent reality. The main characters who try to do right but are continuously baffled, thwarted and confused about what it really means to do right represent Kafka himself in his spiritual struggles. They embody the situation of people who retain a strong sense of moral responsibility even after losing faith in traditional religious authorities and teachings. The sense of duty and moral commandment survives the collapse of particular religious systems, leaving individuals with obligations they cannot clearly define or fulfill. This creates a form of secular spirituality based on ethical striving rather than doctrinal belief or ritual practice. Kafka's religious sensibility is deeply connected to his experience as a Jew in early 20th century Central Europe. He was born into a family that had become largely assimilated and secular, maintaining only perfunctory connections to traditional Jewish religious practices and community life. Yet he could not escape the cultural and psychological legacy of Jewish religious consciousness, with its emphasis on moral responsibility, textual interpretation, and the problematic relationship between human beings and divine authority. His work reflects the situation of people who have inherited religious questions without religious answers. The absence of clear divine guidance creates particular problems for moral decision-making in Kafka's world. Characters want to do what is right, but have no reliable way to determine what rightness means in their particular circumstances. Traditional religious authorities have lost their credibility, but no secular alternatives have emerged to take their place. This leaves individuals completely responsible for their moral choices without any transcendent framework to guide or justify their decisions. The theme of sacrifice appears frequently in Kafka's work, but it is sacrifice without clear purpose or recipient. Characters give up their health, happiness, relationships, and sometimes their lives, but it is never clear what these sacrifices accomplish or whether they serve any meaningful purpose. The logic of sacrifice requires some understanding of what is being exchanged and why, but Kafka's characters sacrifice themselves to forces they cannot comprehend for reasons they cannot articulate. This suggests that the religious impulse towards self-sacrifice persists even when the religious framework that originally gave it meaning has disappeared. Prayer and religious seeking continue in Kafka's world, but they receive no response and lead to no satisfactory resolution. The famous parable Before the Law presents a man who spends his entire life waiting for permission to enter the law, only to discover at the end that the entrance was meant only for him and is now being closed. This suggests that the divine or transcendent reality we seek may be available to us, but only in ways we cannot recognize, or at times we are not prepared to receive it. The tragedy lies not in God's absence, but in our inability to perceive or respond to God's presence when it is offered. Kafka's religious themes ultimately point toward questions about how to live meaningfully in the absence of traditional religious certainties. When we can no longer rely on established doctrines, institutional authorities, or inherited traditions to guide our spiritual lives, we must develop new forms of religious consciousness. This might involve maintaining openness to transcendent reality, while accepting that such reality will always remain largely unknowable and unpredictable. The goal is not to solve the religious problem, but to live authentically within the tension between spiritual longing and spiritual uncertainty. The persistence of religious themes in Kafka's secular work suggests that the religious dimension of human experience cannot be eliminated simply by rejecting particular religious beliefs or institutions. The questions that religions attempt to address about meaning, mortality, morality, and transcendence remain pressing even when traditional religious answers no longer seem credible. Kafka's negative theology provides a way of remaining engaged with these questions without claiming to possess final answers or ultimate truth. It is a form of spirituality that is sustained by seeking rather than finding, by questions rather than answers, by faith in the importance of the search rather than confidence in any particular destination. Part 10. Communication and language failure. Language, which should serve as the primary tool for human connection and understanding, becomes in Kafka's world a source of persistent misunderstanding and deepening isolation. Characters consistently find that their words fail to convey their intended meanings, that others misinterpret their most carefully crafted communications, and that attempts at explanation only create further confusion. This breakdown of communication reflects deeper problems with language itself as a medium for sharing inner experience and creating genuine human connection. The tools we depend on to reach out to others become barriers that reinforce our fundamental isolation from one another. The failure of communication manifests most clearly in the conversations between characters who seem to be speaking entirely different languages even when using the same words. They talk past each other, respond to questions that were not asked, and interpret statements in ways that bear no relationship to what was intended. These miscommunications are not accidental or temporary, but systematic and persistent, suggesting that the problem lies not with particular speakers, but with the nature of language itself. Words carry different associations and connotations for different people based on their experiences, backgrounds, and contexts, making perfect communication impossible even under the best circumstances. Kafka understood that the attempt to translate inner experience into public language necessarily involves distortion, simplification, and loss of meaning that cannot be avoided or corrected. Our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are unique to our individual consciousness, and cannot be fully shared with others, no matter how skillfully we use words. Language operates through generalizations and categories that inevitably miss the particular nuances of any specific experience. What we actually say is always an inadequate approximation of what we think or feel, and what others understand is always an interpretation that transforms our meaning in unpredictable ways. Technology, which promises to improve communication and overcome the barriers of time and space, actually compounds these problems in Kafka's vision. The telephone serves as a perfect symbol of false connection, creating the illusion of presence and contact while maintaining actual separation and distance. Modern communication technologies multiply opportunities for misunderstanding while creating expectations of clarity and immediacy that cannot be fulfilled. The more sophisticated our tools for communication become, the more obvious becomes the fundamental impossibility of truly understanding or being understood by another human being. Written communication faces particular challenges because it lacks the contextual cues and immediate feedback that characterize face-to-face conversation. Documents, letters, and official communications become sources of confusion rather than clarity, interpreted in ways their authors never intended and used for purposes they never envisioned. The bureaucratic reliance on written procedures and regulations creates systematic opportunities for misunderstanding and manipulation. Words on paper take on a life of their own, becoming weapons that can be used against the people they were supposedly written to protect or serve. The breakdown of communication has particular significance in legal and institutional contexts where precision of language is supposedly crucial. Laws, regulations, and official procedures depend on shared understanding of what words mean and how they should be interpreted, but this shared understanding proves to be illusory. Officials and citizens, lawyers and clients, judges and defendants operate with fundamentally different assumptions about language and meaning, leading to systematic injustice disguised as procedural correctness. The claim that everyone is equal before the law becomes meaningless when people cannot understand what the law actually says or means. Kafka's characters often find themselves trapped by their own words, discovered to have said things they did not mean or committed themselves to positions they do not actually hold. Language becomes a trap rather than a tool, ensnaring speakers in webs of meaning they cannot escape or control. The attempt to clarify or correct previous statements only creates new opportunities for misunderstanding and further entanglement. This reflects the broader human experience of being misunderstood, not only by others but by ourselves, discovering that we do not always know what we think or mean until we try to put it into words. The failure of language to create genuine connection between human beings has profound implications for all forms of relationship and community. Love, friendship, family bonds and social cooperation all depend on some level of mutual understanding and shared meaning. but these foundations prove to be far more fragile than we typically assume. People can live together, work together, and care for each other while remaining fundamentally unknown to one another, connected by routine and habit rather than genuine comprehension. The discovery of this isolation can be devastating, calling into question the authenticity of relationships we thought we understood. Yet Kafka also suggests that the recognition of communication's limitations might open up different possibilities for human connection. When we accept that perfect understanding is impossible, we might become more patient with misunderstanding and more generous in our interpretations of others' words and actions. Instead of demanding that others express themselves clearly and unambiguously, we might take more responsibility for trying to understand what they are attempting to communicate. The goal shifts from achieving perfect communication to maintaining good faith efforts at connection, despite inevitable failures and frustrations. The problem of communication also points toward questions about the relationship between public and private language, between the words we use with others and the thoughts we think to ourselves. Even our internal monologue may be inadequate to capture the full complexity of our own experience, suggesting that the problem with language runs deeper than its social dimension. We may be as unknown to ourselves as we are to others, unable to achieve the self-knowledge that might serve as a foundation for genuine communication with other people. This internal opacity compounds the external difficulties of sharing our thoughts and feelings with others. Ultimately, Kafka's treatment of communication failure reflects his broader themes about the impossibility of achieving perfect knowledge or complete understanding of ourselves, others, or the world around us. Language is simply one more human tool that proves inadequate to the tasks we ask it to perform. One more source of frustration in our ongoing struggle to make sense of our experience and connect meaningfully with other people. The recognition of these limitations does not eliminate the need for communication, but requires us to approach it with greater humility and lower expectations. The value of communication may lie not in its success at conveying information, but in its demonstration of our ongoing commitment to reaching out across the isolation that separates every individual consciousness from every other. Part 11. Time and Temporality. Time in Kafka's world operates according to logic that defies ordinary human understanding and expectation. Characters find themselves trapped in endless loops of repetitive action, waiting for events that never occur, or experiencing sudden transformations that compress years of change into single moments. This distortion of temporal experience reflects deeper problems with how human beings relate to duration, memory, and the passage of time in modern existence. The reassuring progression from past through present to future breaks down, leaving characters suspended in perpetual uncertainty about when anything meaningful will happen or whether it already has happened without their awareness. The dreamlike quality of time values appears throughout Kafka's work, particularly in the trial, where the proceedings seem to exist outside normal temporal boundaries. Joseph K's case drags on indefinitely without apparent progress or resolution, yet he experiences intense psychological pressure that suggests time is running out. The legal system operates according to its own temporal logic that bears no relationship to the urgency felt by those caught within it. This mismatch between subjective time, with its sense of crisis and immediacy, and institutional time, with its bureaucratic delays and endless procedures, creates a form of temporal alienation that compounds all other forms of estrangement. The assumption of an interior time that differs radically from clock time or calendar time reflects Kafka's understanding that human consciousness experiences duration in ways that cannot be measured by external instruments. Moments of anxiety or anticipation can feel like hours, while years of routine activity can pass without leaving any significant trace in memory. The intensity of psychological experience determines its temporal weight more than its actual duration in measurable time. This creates a fundamental disconnect between how we experience our lives and how they appear when viewed from external perspectives that rely on objective temporal measurement. Waiting becomes one of the most characteristic temporal experiences in Kafka's world, but it is waiting without clear object or definite endpoint. Characters wait for trials that never begin, for permissions that never come, for authorities who never appear, for transformations that never complete themselves. This waiting is not the temporary inconvenience of delayed gratification, but a permanent condition that defines their entire existence. They cannot abandon their waiting because they have no alternative activities to pursue. Yet the waiting itself prevents them from engaging meaningfully with any present moment or immediate experience. The temporal structure of Kafka's narratives often mirrors the psychological experience of his characters. Events unfold without clear causal connections or logical progression, creating a sense that anything might happen at any moment, or that nothing will ever happen again. The beginning, middle, and end of traditional storytelling give way to an endless middle that extends indefinitely in all directions. This reflects the modern experience of living in historical time that seems to have lost its direction and meaning, where progress is no longer assumed, and where the future appears more threatening than promising. Memory functions unreliably in Kafka's world, unable to provide the continuity of personal identity that we normally expect from our past experience. Characters cannot clearly remember what they did yesterday or last year, cannot trace the origins of their current circumstances, and cannot learn from previous mistakes because they cannot clearly recall what those mistakes were. The past becomes as uncertain and inaccessible as the future, leaving characters stranded in a present moment that provides no context for understanding their situation. This temporal disorientation contributes to the fundamental confusion about identity and purpose that plague most of Kafka's protagonists. The relationship between individual time and social time becomes particularly problematic in Kafka's depiction of modern institutional life. Bureaucracies operate according to schedules and deadlines that serve institutional needs rather than individual ones, forcing people to synchronize their personal rhythms with organizational requirements. The natural cycles of energy, attention and motivation are subordinated to artificial temporal structures that maximize efficiency and control rather than human well-being. This creates a form of temporal alienation where people feel increasingly disconnected from their own biological and psychological rhythms. Work time becomes separated from lifetime in ways that fragment human experience and create artificial divisions between meaningful and meaningless activity. Characters spend most of their waking hours performing tasks that feel disconnected from their authentic interests and values, saving their real lives for brief periods of leisure that never provide enough time for genuine satisfaction or fulfillment. The commodification of time transforms duration from a medium of human experience into a resource to be bought and sold, measured and managed according to economic rather than personal criteria. This temporal alienation reflects broader patterns of estrangement that characterize modern industrial society. The cyclical nature of much activity in Kafka's world suggests that apparent change may be illusory, and that people may be trapped in repetitive patterns that create the appearance of movement while actually leading nowhere. Characters repeat the same actions day after day, visit the same offices and speak to the same officials, follow the same procedures that produce the same non-results. This cyclical time differs from the natural cycles of seasons or biological rhythms because it lacks any underlying purpose or organic development. It is mechanical repetition rather than meaningful recurrence, creating a sense of temporal imprisonment rather than temporal harmony. The acceleration of modern life creates new forms of temporal anxiety that appear throughout Kafka's work. Characters feel constantly pressured to act quickly and decisively, yet they lack the information and understanding necessary for intelligent action. The pace of change in their environment outstrips their ability to comprehend and adapt to new circumstances, leaving them perpetually behind and struggling to catch up. This temporal mismatch between the speed of external change and the slower pace of human understanding creates chronic stress and disorientation. Yet Kafka also suggests possibilities for different ways of relating to time that might provide some relief from these temporal pathologies. The acceptance of uncertainty about the future might free us from the anxiety of trying to control outcomes beyond our influence. The recognition that meaningful experience occurs in qualitative rather than quantitative time might help us focus on the depth rather than the duration of our activities. Learning to live more fully in present moments, without constant reference to past regrets or future fears, might provide a foundation for more authentic temporal experience. Part 12. Death and Mortality. Death permeates Kafka's work not as a dramatic event that concludes life, but as a constant presence that renders all human activity ultimately meaningless. His characters live with the persistent awareness that death makes everything they do temporary and insignificant, yet they cannot escape the burden of acting as if their choices matter. This creates a fundamental tension between the human need for meaning and purpose and the reality of mortality that seems to negate all meaning and purpose. Death is not simply the end of life, but the fact that gives life its absurd character, the background against which all human striving appears futile and desperate. The awareness of mortality shapes every aspect of experience in ways that characters often do not consciously recognize. The knowledge that we will die, that everyone we love will die, and that everything we create will eventually be destroyed, influences how we relate to work, relationships, achievements, and daily activities. This knowledge can paralyze action by making all effort seem pointless, or it can intensify experience by making every moment precious and irreplaceable. Kafka explores both possibilities, showing characters who become passive in the face of mortality and others who become desperately active in their attempts to create something lasting. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor's transformation can be read as a kind of living death, a premature separation from normal human life that allows Kafka to explore what happens when social death precedes biological death. Gregor becomes invisible to his family and society while retaining consciousness and emotional capacity, experiencing the isolation and irrelevance that mortality ultimately brings to everyone. His physical death at the end of the story comes almost as a relief, the final confirmation of a process that was already complete. The family's rapid recovery and renewed vitality suggest that death may be necessary for life to continue, that the removal of the dying allows the living to flourish. The trial presents death as the ultimate verdict that cannot be appealed or avoided, regardless of the legal proceedings that supposedly justify it. Joseph K's execution occurs without any clear determination of guilt or innocence, suggesting that death comes to everyone regardless of their moral status or legal standing. The legal system serves not to determine who deserves to die, but to provide a ritualized framework for the inevitable fact that everyone dies. The proceedings gradually merge into the judgment because the process of living gradually merges into the process of dying, making guilt and innocence irrelevant categories. Kafka's treatment of death reflects his understanding that modern secular culture lacks adequate resources for dealing with mortality. Traditional religious frameworks provided meaning for death by placing it within larger cosmic narratives about salvation, judgment, and eternal life. When these frameworks lose their credibility, death becomes simply termination without transcendent significance or compensating meaning. This leaves individuals to confront mortality without institutional support or cultural wisdom about how to live authentically in the face of inevitable death. The arbitrary timing of death appears as a constant source of anxiety in Kafka's world. Characters cannot predict when death will come to themselves or others, cannot prepare adequately for its arrival, and cannot control its circumstances or timing. This unpredictability makes it impossible to plan life rationally or to achieve the security and control that human beings naturally desire. The possibility of sudden death haunts every long-term project and every investment in future happiness, making all planning seem simultaneously essential and futile. The social aspects of death receive particular attention in Kafka's exploration of how mortality affects relationships and community. The knowledge that relationships will end through death creates both urgency and reserve in human connections, making people simultaneously desperate for intimacy and afraid of the loss that intimacy makes inevitable. Love becomes complicated by the awareness that everyone we love will eventually die, leaving us either to mourn their loss or to die first and leave them to mourn ours. This temporal asymmetry means that every relationship contains within itself the seeds of its own tragic conclusion. The professional and economic aspects of modern life appear particularly absurd when viewed from the perspective of mortality. Characters spend enormous amounts of time and energy on careers and financial security that death will ultimately render meaningless. The pursuit of success, status, and material accumulation continues despite the obvious fact that death makes all such achievements temporary and ultimately worthless. This suggests either profound self-deception about the reality of mortality or a desperate attempt to create meaning through activity that we know will not survive our own deaths. Yet Kafka also explores how the awareness of death might serve as a source of clarity and authentic choice. When we truly accept our mortality, we may become more discriminating about how we spend our limited time and energy. The knowledge that we cannot do everything or have everything might help us focus on what matters most to us personally rather than what others expect us to value. Mortality can serve as a criterion for distinguishing between activities that feel genuinely meaningful and those that merely fill time or meet social expectations. The artistic response to mortality appears throughout Kafka's work as both an attempt to create something lasting and an acknowledgement that even art cannot overcome the reality of death. Writing serves as a way of preserving experience and communicating across time, but it also reveals the inadequacy of all human attempts to achieve immortality through creation. The works that survive their creators do so in forms that the creators cannot control, interpreted by readers who may understand them in ways completely different from what was intended. Art provides a form of symbolic immortality, while simultaneously demonstrating the impossibility of literal immortality. The philosophical problem of mortality in Kafka's work ultimately points toward questions about how to live authentically when we know that our time is limited and our achievements will not last. This requires developing what we might call mortal wisdom, the ability to act meaningfully within the constraints imposed by our finite existence. Such wisdom involves neither denying the reality of death nor being paralyzed by its inevitability, but finding ways to create meaning and value that do not depend on permanence or immortality. The goal is not to overcome mortality, but to live fully within its boundaries, accepting both the urgency and the limitations that death imposes on all human experience. Part 13. Father-son relationships and family dynamics. The father-son conflict serves as one of the most persistent and emotionally charged themes throughout Kafka's work, representing not just personal family dynamics, but broader patterns of authority, rebellion, and generational transmission of trauma. The guilt induced in sons by overwhelming fathers seeks resolution through suffering and atonement, but this resolution never comes in any satisfactory form. Instead, the pattern repeats across generations, with sons growing up to become the very kinds of fathers they once feared and resented. This cyclical nature of family pathology suggests that individual psychological problems reflect deeper structural issues with how power and love are distributed within families and society. Kafka's own relationship with his father, Hermann, profoundly influenced his understanding of how parental authority can damage rather than nurture the development of children. Hermann Kafka was a successful businessman who valued practical achievement, social conformity, and material success above the intellectual and artistic pursuits that attracted his son. The father's physical presence, emotional volatility, and material success created a standard that the son felt he could never meet, leading to a lifelong sense of inadequacy and failure. This personal experience became the foundation for Kafka's broader exploration of how authority figures use their power to diminish rather than empower those under their control. The letter to his father, written in 1919 but never delivered, provides the most direct exploration of these family dynamics in Kafka's work. In this document, Kafka attempts to explain to his father how parental authority damaged his capacity for independent action and authentic relationship. Yet the letter also reveals Kafka's continued dependence on his father's approval and his inability to break free from patterns established in early childhood. The very act of writing the letter demonstrates both the son's desperate need for understanding and his recognition that such understanding may be impossible to achieve. The theme of paternal authority extends beyond biological fathers to encompass all forms of institutional and social authority that claim parental roles. Employers, government officials, religious leaders, and other authority figures often function as father substitutes in Kafka's work, wielding power in ways that infantilize rather than mature those subject to their control. These institutional fathers demand obedience and gratitude while providing neither clear guidance nor genuine care for the welfare of their symbolic children. The result is a society filled with people who remain psychologically immature because they have never been allowed to develop independent judgment and autonomous action. The absent or ineffective father creates different but equally damaging problems for the children who must grow up without adequate paternal guidance or protection. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor's father initially appears weak and dependent, unable to support his family financially or emotionally. But when Gregor's transformation forces the father to assume responsibility, he becomes harsh and rejecting, driving his son away with violence and disgust. This transformation suggests that weak fathers may suddenly become tyrannical when their authority is threatened, overcompensating for previous inadequacy with excessive harshness. The economic dimensions of father-son relationships receive particular attention in Kafka's exploration of how financial dependence creates and maintains unhealthy family dynamics. Adult children who cannot achieve financial independence remain trapped in childlike relationships with parents who use economic control to maintain psychological dominance. Conversely, children who become financial supporters of their families, like Gregor, may gain economic power while remaining emotionally subordinate to parents who resent their dependence. Money becomes a weapon that can be used by either generation to maintain or challenge existing patterns of family authority. The transmission of psychological patterns from one generation to the next appears as an almost inevitable process that individuals seem powerless to interrupt or change. Sons swear they will not repeat their father's mistakes, yet they find themselves unconsciously reproducing the very behaviours they most despised in their own upbringing. This suggests that family dynamics operate at levels deeper than conscious intention or rational choice, embedded in emotional patterns and behavioral habits that resist deliberate modification. Breaking free from destructive family patterns requires not just insight but sustained effort to develop new ways of relating that have no models in previous experience. The role of mothers in these family dynamics often involves either helpless witnessing of father-son conflicts or active participation in maintaining unhealthy patterns through excessive protection or emotional manipulation. Mothers may attempt to compensate for paternal harshness by becoming overly indulgent, creating different forms of dependence and immaturity. Alternatively, they may side with fathers against children, using maternal authority to reinforce paternal control and making rebellion appear not just difficult, but morally wrong. The mother's position between father and son often makes her a victim of family dynamics she cannot control and may not fully understand. Sibling relationships in Kafka's work often reflect and amplify the problems created by dysfunctional parental authority. Brothers and sisters compete for limited parental love and approval, developing rivalries that persist into adulthood and prevent genuine friendship or mutual support. The favouring of one child over others creates resentment and jealousy that poison family relationships and make authentic intimacy impossible. Siblings may also form alliances against parents, but these alliances are typically temporary and dissolve when individual interests conflict with family loyalty. The broader social implications of damaged family relationships extend throughout Kafka's work as a source of political and institutional pathology. People who grow up in families dominated by arbitrary authority and emotional manipulation may be predisposed to accept similar treatment from political and economic institutions. They may seek out authoritarian leaders who promise to provide the protection and guidance they never received from their own fathers, or they may become authoritarian themselves as a way of compensating for childhood powerlessness. The personal becomes political when family dynamics shape how individuals relate to all forms of power and authority throughout their lives. Yet Kafka also suggests possibilities for breaking free from destructive family patterns through the development of authentic individuality and genuine personal relationships. This requires recognizing how family dynamics have shaped our personalities and behavioral patterns, then making conscious choices to develop different ways of relating to others. The goal is not to reject all authority or responsibility, but to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate exercises of power in both family and social contexts. Breaking free from family pathology becomes a model for broader social and political liberation from all forms of oppressive authority. Part 14. Sexuality and Desire. Sexuality in Kafka's work appears as another realm of human experience marked by frustration, misunderstanding, and the inability to achieve genuine intimacy or satisfaction. Desire creates connections between people, but these connections often prove to be based on misperception, manipulation, or the projection of unconscious needs rather than authentic recognition of the other person. Characters seek love and physical intimacy as escapes from isolation and meaninglessness, but they typically find that sexual relationships create new forms of alienation and confusion rather than the connection they desperately seek. The promise of sexuality as a realm of authentic human experience repeatedly fails to deliver the fulfillment and meaning that characters hope to find through erotic connection. The relationship between power and sexuality appears as a central concern in much of Kafka's work, reflecting his understanding that erotic relationships cannot escape the broader patterns of domination and submission that characterize social relationships generally. Sexual desire makes people vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation by others who may use erotic attraction to gain psychological or material advantages. Conversely, the possession of sexual attractiveness or the ability to provide sexual satisfaction can become forms of power that allow people to control and influence others in ways that may have little to do with genuine affection or care. The supposedly private realm of sexuality becomes entangled with public concerns about status, control, and the distribution of social resources. In the trial, sexuality appears consistently in contexts that involve the abuse of power and the corruption of justice. Women associated with the court system use their sexual attractiveness to gain access to information and influence, while male officials use their institutional authority to demand sexual favors from women who need their help. These exchanges reveal how supposedly neutral institutional processes become contaminated by personal desires and private interests that have nothing to do with justice or rational administration. The sexual dimension of corruption shows how institutional authority can be used to satisfy individual appetites while maintaining the appearance of legitimate public service. The theme of sexual humiliation and shame runs throughout Kafka's exploration of erotic relationships, reflecting his understanding that sexuality makes people vulnerable in ways they cannot fully control or predict. The exposure involved in sexual intimacy, both physical and emotional, creates opportunities for rejection, ridicule, and emotional damage that can have lasting effects on individual psychology and behavior. Characters who seek love and acceptance through sexual relationships often find themselves more isolated and damaged than they were before attempting to connect with others. The very intensity of sexual desire, which promises to overcome alienation and loneliness, can become a source of additional suffering when relationships fail to provide the connection and meaning that desire seems to promise. The commodification of sexuality appears in Kafka's work as another example of how modern capitalist society transforms human relationships into market transactions. Sexual attractiveness becomes a commodity that can be bought and sold, used to advance careers or gain social advantages, treated as a resource to be managed and maximized rather than an expression of authentic feeling. This commodification makes genuine erotic connection more difficult because participants in sexual relationships cannot be certain whether they are valued for themselves or for their utility in achieving non-sexual goals. The market logic that governs economic relationships penetrates intimate relationships, making authenticity and spontaneity difficult to achieve or maintain. Marriage and family relationships in Kafka's work often demonstrate the ways that sexual desire becomes domesticated and regulated by social institutions that may care more about social stability than individual happiness or fulfillment. The legal and economic framework of marriage shapes sexual relationships according to concerns about property, inheritance and social status that may have little connection to the emotional and physical needs of the individuals involved. Sexual attraction that might naturally be temporary and spontaneous becomes locked into permanent legal arrangements that outlast the desire that originally motivated them. This institutionalization of sexuality creates new forms of obligation and resentment that poison the very relationships it was supposed to protect and nurture. The relationship between sexuality and creativity appears in Kafka's own life and work as a source of both inspiration and conflict. Erotic desire provided material for artistic exploration, while also creating emotional complications that interfered with sustained creative work. The energy that fueled sexual attraction and romantic obsession was closely related to the energy that powered literary creation, making it difficult to pursue both simultaneously. Kafka's personal relationships with women often involved complex negotiations between his need for intimacy and his need for the solitude and independence that his writing required. The theme of sexual transgression and forbidden desire reflects Kafka's understanding that sexuality often involves attractions and impulses that conflict with social norms and personal moral standards. Characters find themselves drawn to people they know they should avoid, or attracted to behaviors they recognize as destructive or inappropriate. These conflicts between desire and moral judgment create internal divisions that make authentic action difficult and self-knowledge problematic. The gap between what people want and what they think they should want becomes a source of ongoing psychological tension and moral confusion. The failure of sexual relationships to provide lasting satisfaction or meaning reflects broader themes in Kafka's work about the impossibility of achieving permanent solutions to the problems of human existence. Sexual fulfillment, like other forms of satisfaction, proves to be temporary and partial, requiring constant renewal and never providing the complete resolution of loneliness and alienation that desire seems to promise. This does not mean that sexuality is worthless or that erotic relationships should be avoided, but rather that they must be pursued with realistic expectations about what they can and cannot accomplish. The goal shifts from finding perfect sexual fulfillment to maintaining authentic connection despite the inevitable frustrations and disappointments that accompany all intimate relationships. Yet Kafka also suggests that sexuality, precisely because it involves vulnerability and risk, may provide opportunities for genuine human connection that are not available in more protected and controlled interactions. The intensity of sexual desire can break through the barriers of self-protection and social convention that normally prevent people from reaching each other authentically. Even when sexual relationships fail to provide lasting happiness, they may offer moments of genuine recognition and connection that justify the risks and difficulties they involve. The value of sexuality may lie not in its capacity to solve the problems of human existence, but in its ability to provide experiences of intensity and meaning that make existence more tolerable and occasionally transcendent. Part 15. Work and Economic Life. Work appears throughout Kafka's writings as a realm of fundamental alienation where human beings are reduced to functions within systems they do not understand and cannot control. Characters typically hold jobs that feel mechanical and purposeless, contributing to organizational goals that remain unclear while performing tasks that provide no intrinsic satisfaction or meaning. The economic necessity that forces people to work conflicts with their deeper needs for creative expression, personal autonomy, and meaningful engagement with the world. This creates a split between work life and authentic life that fragments human experience and makes integrated selfhood difficult or impossible to achieve. Gregor Samsa's situation as a travelling salesman exemplifies the problems of modern employment, where workers become completely interchangeable parts in economic machinery. He works at a job he hates, but cannot escape because of his family's financial dependence on his income. The work itself involves no creativity or personal investment, merely the repetitive execution of sales procedures that could be performed equally well by anyone with minimal training. This interchangeability makes workers feel expendable and worthless, valuable only for their capacity to perform specific functions rather than for their individual qualities or human potential. The transformation of human labour into a commodity that can be bought and sold creates psychological effects that extend far beyond the workplace itself. When people must sell their time and energy to survive, they begin to see themselves primarily in economic terms, measuring their worth by their earning capacity and market value. This commodification of human activity makes it difficult to maintain a sense of intrinsic dignity and worth that does not depend on economic productivity. People who cannot work, or whose work is not well compensated, may feel that they have no legitimate claim to social recognition or personal self-respect. The bureaucratic organization of modern work creates additional layers of alienation through the multiplication of meaningless procedures and administrative requirements. Workers spend increasing amounts of time filling out forms, attending meetings, and following regulations that seem designed more to maintain organizational control than to accomplish any productive purpose. The logic of bureaucratic efficiency often conflicts with the logic of actually getting useful work done, creating frustration and cynicism among employees who see their efforts wasted on activities that serve no clear function. The bureaucratization of work transforms potentially meaningful activities into exercises in procedural compliance that drain energy and motivation. Kafka's own experience working for an insurance company provided direct insight into how modern institutional employment can trap individuals in roles that utilize only a small fraction of their human capacities. He spent his days processing claims and writing reports about workplace accidents, work that was socially useful but personally unfulfilling. The contrast between his daytime employment and his nighttime writing highlighted the split between economic necessity and authentic creative expression that many people experience in modern society. The energy and attention required by his job left limited resources for the literary work that he considered his true vocation, creating ongoing tension between survival and self-realization. The relationship between work and personal identity becomes problematic when people define themselves primarily through their occupational roles. Characters who lose their jobs or become unable to work may experience crises of self-worth and social identity that go far beyond the practical problems of financial insecurity. Conversely, people who achieve success in their careers may find that professional accomplishment does not provide the personal satisfaction they expected, leading to questions about whether they have wasted their lives pursuing goals that ultimately prove meaningless. The modern tendency to collapse personal worth into professional achievement creates vulnerability to identity crises when career circumstances change. The temporal aspects of modern employment create particular problems for human well-being and authentic living. The separation of work time from personal time fragments daily experience and makes it difficult to achieve an integrated sense of purpose and meaning. People may spend the majority of their waking hours engaged in activities they do not value, saving their authentic selves for brief periods of leisure that never provide enough time for genuine fulfillment. This temporal alienation reflects broader patterns of estrangement that make modern life feel discontinuous and fragmented rather than coherent and meaningful. The economic pressure to maintain employment often forces people to compromise their personal values and authentic preferences in ways that damage their sense of integrity and self-respect. Workers may find themselves participating in activities they consider morally questionable or socially harmful because they cannot afford to lose their jobs. This economic coercion makes genuine moral choice difficult, and may lead to a cynical acceptance of ethical compromise as an inevitable feature of adult life. The need to survive economically can override the need to maintain moral consistency, creating internal conflicts that are difficult to resolve satisfactorily. The promise of technological progress to reduce the burden of work and increase human freedom appears in Kafka's vision as largely illusory. New technologies may make specific tasks easier or faster, but they also create new forms of control and monitoring that reduce worker autonomy and privacy. The acceleration of work processes through technological efficiency often leads to increased expectations for productivity, rather than reduced working hours or greater leisure time. Technology becomes another tool for intensifying rather than reducing the alienation and stress that characterize modern employment relationships. The class dimensions of work-related alienation reflect broader patterns of social inequality that extend beyond the workplace to encompass all aspects of social life. People who must work primarily with their hands or bodies often have less autonomy and social status than those whose work involves mental or creative activities. These distinctions create hierarchies of social worth that affect not only economic rewards, but also personal dignity and social recognition. The degradation of manual labor and the glorification of intellectual work reflect cultural values that fail to recognize the full range of human capacities and contributions. Yet Kafka also suggests possibilities for finding meaning and authenticity within the constraints of economic necessity. The key lies in maintaining some separation between personal worth and economic function, recognizing that work is something we do rather than something we are. This requires developing sources of meaning and identity that do not depend entirely on occupational success or professional recognition. The goal is not to eliminate the need for economically productive activity, but to prevent economic requirements from completely overwhelming other dimensions of human experience and value. Part 16. The Individual versus Society. The tension between individual authenticity and social conformity permeates every aspect of Kafka's work, reflecting his understanding that modern society creates systematic pressures for people to suppress their genuine selves in favor of socially acceptable personas. Characters find themselves caught between the need to maintain their personal integrity and the practical necessity of fitting into social roles and meeting external expectations. This conflict is not accidental or temporary, but built into the structure of modern social organization, which requires predictable behavior and standardized responses from individuals whose inner lives remain necessarily complex and unpredictable. The result is a form of social alienation where people feel like actors playing roles rather than authentic persons expressing their true nature. Society in Kafka's vision operates as a vast mechanism for processing individuals according to predetermined categories and procedures. People become cases to be classified, problems to be solved, or resources to be utilized rather than unique persons with particular needs and capacities. This mechanistic approach to human relationships makes genuine recognition and authentic connection difficult because social institutions are designed to deal with types rather than individuals. The bureaucratic efficiency that modern society prizes depends on treating people as interchangeable units whose personal characteristics are relevant only insofar as they affect their ability to perform designated functions. The pressure to conform begins early in life through educational institutions that reward compliance and punish deviation from established norms. Children learn to suppress their natural curiosity and creativity in favor of behaviors that please teachers and parents who represent social authority. This early training in conformity shapes personality development in ways that make later rebellion or authentic self-expression difficult even when external pressures are reduced. The internalization of social expectations creates internal conflicts between what people genuinely want and what they think they should want, leading to a divided consciousness that makes authentic action problematic. Economic pressures provide another powerful mechanism for enforcing social conformity by making survival dependent on meeting external expectations about productive behavior. People who cannot or will not conform to established patterns of employment, consumption, and social participation may find themselves excluded from the economic system entirely. This economic coercion is often more effective than direct political oppression because it appears to offer choices while actually constraining them within very narrow limits. The appearance of freedom makes it more difficult to identify and resist the sources of social control, leaving individuals to blame themselves for their inability to achieve satisfaction within existing arrangements. The role of social institutions in shaping individual consciousness extends beyond their official functions to encompass their capacity to define what counts as normal, healthy, and desirable. Medical, legal, educational, and religious institutions claim authority not only over external behavior, but also over internal experience, defining what kinds of thoughts, feelings, and desires are acceptable. This institutional colonization of consciousness makes it difficult for individuals to distinguish between their authentic preferences and socially induced ones. People may pursue goals and adopt values that feel personal but actually reflect the successful internalization of social expectations rather than genuine individual choice. The phenomenon of social roles provides both necessary structure for human interaction and potential obstacles to authentic self-expression. Roles like employee, parent, citizen, and consumer offer guidelines for behavior that make social coordination possible, but they also constrain individual expression within predetermined patterns. People may find themselves trapped in roles that no longer fit their developing sense of themselves, unable to change, because too much of their identity and social connections depend on maintaining established patterns. The multiplication of social roles in complex modern societies creates additional complications, as people struggle to integrate different and sometimes conflicting role expectations into coherent personal identities. Kafka explores how social control operates not primarily through force or explicit coercion, but through the manipulation of shame, guilt, and the desire for acceptance. People police themselves more effectively than any external authority could by internalizing social standards and judging themselves according to external criteria. This self-surveillance makes resistance difficult because it operates at the level of personal identity rather than external behavior, making conformity feel like personal choice rather than social compulsion. The effectiveness of this form of control lies in its ability to enlist individuals as active participants in their own limitation and diminishment. The promise of individualism as an alternative to conformity proves largely illusory in Kafka's analysis because apparent individual choices are often shaped by social forces that remain invisible to the choosing subject. Consumer culture creates the appearance of individual choice while channeling that choice within predetermined options that serve systemic rather than personal needs. Political democracy offers the appearance of individual political agency while constraining political participation within institutional forms that may not allow for meaningful change. The ideology of individualism may actually serve to disguise and legitimate new forms of social control, rather than providing genuine alternatives to conformist pressures. Yet Kafka also suggests that authentic individuality remains possible for those willing to pay the price of social isolation and material insecurity. This requires developing sufficient inner resources to maintain personal integrity without external validation or support. It also requires learning to distinguish between legitimate social obligations that deserve respect and arbitrary social expectations that can be safely ignored. The development of authentic individuality becomes a form of resistance to social forces that seek to reduce people to predictable and manageable functions within larger systems. The relationship between individual authenticity and social responsibility creates ongoing tensions that cannot be resolved through simple formulas or ideological positions. People have genuine obligations to others that may sometimes require sacrificing personal preferences or immediate desires. But they also have obligations to themselves and to the possibility of authentic human existence that may sometimes require resisting social expectations and accepting social disapproval. The challenge lies in developing the wisdom to distinguish between situations that call for accommodation and those that demand resistance, recognizing that this judgment cannot be made according to fixed rules, but must emerge from ongoing engagement with particular circumstances. The goal of individual-society relations in Kafka's vision is not the elimination of social structures or the achievement of complete individual autonomy, but the creation of conditions that allow for genuine choice about how to relate to social expectations and institutional demands. This requires social institutions that are more flexible and responsive to individual differences, as well as individuals who are more conscious of their own authentic needs and more skilled at maintaining personal integrity within social contexts. The aim is a dynamic balance rather than a final resolution, recognizing that the tension between individual and social needs reflects permanent features of human existence rather than temporary problems that can be definitively solved. The value lies not in resolving this tension, but in maintaining it creatively and constructively, rather than allowing it to become destructive to either personal authenticity or social cooperation. Part 17. Anxiety and Existential Dread. Anxiety in Kafka's work is not the specific fear of particular threats, but a more fundamental dread that emerges from the basic conditions of human existence itself. This existential anxiety cannot be resolved by eliminating external dangers or achieving greater security, because it arises from the awareness of human finitude, the burden of freedom, and the absence of ultimate meaning or purpose. Characters experience persistent feelings of unease and apprehension even when nothing particularly threatening is happening in their immediate circumstances. This suggests that anxiety is built into human consciousness itself, a permanent feature of being human rather than a temporary response to specific situations that can be overcome through appropriate action. The source of this fundamental anxiety lies in the human capacity for self-consciousness, which makes us aware of our own mortality, our radical freedom, and our responsibility for creating whatever meaning our lives will have. Unlike other animals that simply react to immediate circumstances, human beings must live with constant awareness of future possibilities and past choices that create ongoing uncertainty about who we are and what we should do. This temporal consciousness means that we can never simply exist in the present moment, but must always relate to ourselves as beings with histories and futures that we cannot fully control or predict. The weight of this temporal awareness creates chronic background anxiety that colours all other experiences and relationships. Kafka's characters often experience anxiety as a physical sensation that manifests in their bodies as tension, restlessness, and various forms of somatic distress. This embodied quality of anxiety suggests that existential problems are not merely intellectual or philosophical, but affect the whole person at the most basic levels of physical and emotional experience. The mind-body split that Western philosophy often assumes breaks down when anxiety reveals how thoroughly our philosophical and psychological problems penetrate our physical existence. We cannot escape existential anxiety by thinking our way out of it because it operates at levels deeper than conscious rational thought. The social dimensions of anxiety in Kafka's work reflect how individual existential problems are intensified by modern social conditions that provide less support and guidance for dealing with fundamental human concerns. Traditional societies offered religious frameworks, stable communities, and established social roles that helped people manage existential anxiety by providing ready-made answers to questions about meaning and purpose. Modern secular individualistic societies leave people more free but also more isolated in their struggle with basic existential questions. The price of freedom from traditional constraints is increased responsibility for managing anxiety and uncertainty without institutional support or cultural wisdom about how to do so effectively. The relationship between anxiety and guilt appears throughout Kafka's exploration of how people respond to their awareness of radical freedom and moral responsibility. When we recognize that we are completely responsible for our choices and their consequences, we may become paralyzed by anxiety about making the wrong decision or failing to live up to impossible standards of moral perfection. This anxiety about moral adequacy can become more burdensome than actual moral failure because it creates ongoing self-surveillance and self-criticism that prevent spontaneous action or genuine enjoyment. The attempt to escape guilt through perfect behavior only increases anxiety by making us more conscious of our inevitable human limitations and moral imperfections. Kafka shows how institutional structures can deliberately cultivate and exploit anxiety as a means of social control. The legal system in the trial operates by keeping Joseph K. in a constant state of anxious uncertainty about his status and prospects, never providing enough information for him to act effectively, but always suggesting that his situation might become worse if he fails to respond appropriately. This strategic use of anxiety makes people more compliant and easier to control because they become focused on managing their immediate emotional distress rather than questioning the legitimacy of the system that creates that distress. Anxiety becomes a weapon that institutions can use to maintain authority without having to justify their actions or provide rational explanations for their demands. The temporal structure of anxiety involves a peculiar relationship to time, where the present moment becomes infected by fear of future possibilities and regret about past choices. Anxious people cannot fully inhabit the present because they are constantly projecting forward to potential disasters or backward to previous mistakes that might have been avoided. This temporal displacement makes it difficult to respond effectively to actual current circumstances because attention and energy are devoted to managing fantasized rather than real situations. The irony is that anxiety about the future often prevents the kind of present-moment awareness and responsive action that might actually improve future outcomes. Kafka explores how anxiety can become self-perpetuating through the creation of elaborate defense mechanisms that actually increase rather than reduce the original problem. People develop complex strategies for avoiding situations that might trigger anxiety, but these avoidance behaviors often create new sources of limitation and distress. The attempt to control anxiety by controlling external circumstances leads to increasingly restricted and rigid patterns of living that may provide short-term relief but long-term imprisonment. The cure becomes worse than the disease as people sacrifice more and more of their freedom and spontaneity in the futile attempt to achieve perfect security and predictability. Yet, Kafka also suggests that anxiety, properly understood and accepted, might serve as a signal of authentic concerns that deserve attention rather than simply a problem to be eliminated. Existential anxiety may indicate our awareness of genuine responsibilities and real possibilities that we have been avoiding or neglecting. The goal is not to eliminate anxiety entirely, but to distinguish between neurotic anxiety that serves no constructive purpose and realistic anxiety that points toward important choices and actions we need to take. This requires developing tolerance for uncertainty and discomfort, rather than seeking the false comfort of avoiding all anxiety-provoking situations. The relationship between anxiety and creativity appears in Kafka's own experience as both a source of artistic material and an obstacle to sustained creative work. The sensitivity that made him acutely aware of existential problems also provided the psychological raw material for his literary explorations of these themes. But the same sensitivity could also become overwhelming and paralyzing, making it difficult to function in ordinary social and professional contexts. This suggests that anxiety may be the price of consciousness, unavoidable for anyone who remains fully awake to the complexity and uncertainty of human existence. The therapeutic implications of Kafka's treatment of anxiety suggest that the goal should be learning to live creatively with uncertainty rather than achieving a state of permanent calm and security. This requires developing what we might call existential courage, the ability to act meaningfully despite ongoing anxiety about outcomes and consequences. Such courage does not eliminate fear, but prevents fear from eliminating action, allowing people to engage with life fully despite their awareness of its fundamental uncertainty and risk. The paradox is that accepting anxiety as a permanent feature of human existence may reduce its power to control and diminish our lives, while fighting anxiety often increases its influence and restricts our capacity for authentic living. Part 18, Hope and Despair, continued. In one of his most famous observations, Kafka reflected that there is an infinite amount of hope in the universe, but not for us. This captures the essential tragedy of human existence as Kafka understood it. The very capacity for hope that makes us human also makes us suffer because our hopes consistently exceed what reality can provide. We are creatures capable of imagining perfection while trapped in imperfect circumstances. able to conceive of justice while living in unjust systems, longing for meaning while existing in an apparently meaningless universe. Hope becomes both our greatest asset and our greatest vulnerability, the quality that allows us to transcend immediate circumstances while also making us perpetually dissatisfied with what we actually have. The characters in Kafka's stories demonstrate different strategies for managing the tension between hope and reality, none of which prove entirely satisfactory. Some, like Joseph K. in the trial, maintain hope for vindication and justice long after any reasonable person would have abandoned such expectations. This persistence keeps them active and engaged, but also prevents them from adapting to their actual circumstances or finding alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction. Their hope becomes a prison that keeps them fixated on outcomes they cannot control, while missing opportunities for authentic action and genuine connection that might be available in the present moment. Other characters, like Gregor Samsa after his transformation, appear to abandon hope entirely and sink into passive despair that makes any meaningful action impossible. This despair may be more realistic than false hope, but it also eliminates the possibility of discovering unexpected resources or possibilities that might emerge from engaging actively with difficult circumstances. The complete absence of hope can be as limiting as excessive hope because it closes off the openness to experience that authentic living requires. Despair becomes another form of imprisonment, keeping people trapped in current circumstances by convincing them that change is impossible. Kafka suggests that both unrealistic hope and complete despair represent failures to engage authentically with the actual conditions of human existence. Unrealistic hope distracts us from present reality by focusing attention on fantasized futures that may never arrive. Complete despair distracts us from present reality by convincing us that nothing we do matters and that engagement with current circumstances is pointless. Both responses prevent the kind of clear-eyed engagement with immediate experience that might allow for whatever authentic action and meaning remain possible within existing constraints. The social functions of hope and despair receive particular attention in Kafka's analysis of how institutional power operates through the manipulation of these fundamental human emotions. Institutions maintain control partly by fostering false hope that keeps people invested in systems that do not serve their genuine interests. The promise of eventual justice, future prosperity, or ultimate vindication prevents people from recognizing and responding to present injustices and limitations. At the same time, institutions may cultivate despair about the possibility of change or resistance, convincing people that their situation is hopeless and that submission is their only realistic option. The temporal dimensions of hope and despair reflect broader problems with how human beings relate to time and change in modern circumstances. Hope typically involves expectations about future developments that may have little basis in present evidence or past experience. This future orientation can prevent engagement with current opportunities and responsibilities while creating vulnerability to disappointment when expectations are not met. Despair, conversely, often involves the conviction that the future will necessarily resemble the past, eliminating the possibility of genuine change or development. Kafka's treatment of hope suggests that authentic hope must be distinguished from wishful thinking or denial of reality. Authentic hope involves maintaining openness to unexpected possibilities while accepting the limitations and uncertainties that characterize all human situations. This kind of hope does not depend on specific outcomes or guarantee particular results, but rather reflects a fundamental trust in the value of human engagement and effort regardless of external circumstances. It is hope without guarantees, sustained by the conviction that meaningful action remains possible even when meaningful results cannot be assured. The relationship between hope and action becomes crucial in Kafka's philosophy, because hope that does not lead to action may be merely another form of escapism. Similarly, action that is not informed by some sense of possibility and potential meaning may be merely compulsive behavior rather than authentic human choice. The challenge lies in maintaining enough hope to motivate action, while avoiding the kind of false hope that prevents realistic assessment of circumstances and possibilities. This requires developing what we might call mature hope, hope that accepts uncertainty and limitation while remaining committed to whatever authentic possibilities remain available. The creative and artistic dimensions of hope appear in Kafka's own relationship to his writing, as both an expression of hope for communication and meaning, and a recognition that such communication may be fundamentally impossible. The act of writing reflects hope that human experience can be shared, and that individual struggles have broader significance that others might recognize and understand. Yet the difficulties Kafka experienced in completing his major works, and his instructions that they be destroyed after his death, suggest awareness that even artistic communication may fail to bridge the fundamental isolation that separates one consciousness from another. Art becomes an act of hope performed in full awareness that the hope may be unfounded. The philosophical implications of Kafka's treatment of hope and despair point toward questions about how to live authentically when we cannot know whether our hopes are realistic or our fears are justified. This requires developing tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity, rather than seeking the false comfort of either naive optimism or cynical pessimism. The goal is not to resolve the tension between hope and despair, but to live creatively within that tension, remaining open to unexpected possibilities while accepting present limitations. This might involve what we could call hopeful realism, the ability to see circumstances clearly, while maintaining commitment to whatever authentic action and meaning remain possible within those circumstances. Part 19. Identity and Self-Knowledge. The question of personal identity becomes deeply problematic in Kafka's world, where characters consistently find themselves unable to achieve reliable knowledge of who they are, what they want, or what their lives mean. This is not simply a matter of temporary confusion that might be resolved through self-reflection or psychological analysis, but a more fundamental uncertainty about whether stable personal identity is possible or even desirable. Characters struggle to understand their own motivations, cannot predict their own behavior, and discover that they are strangers to themselves in ways that make authentic action and genuine relationship extremely difficult. The modern promise that we can know ourselves through introspection and self-analysis proves to be largely illusory, leaving individuals adrift in a sea of possibilities without reliable anchors for personal identity. The transformation that Gregor undergoes in the Metamorphosis serves as the most dramatic exploration of how quickly and completely personal identity can change in ways that neither the individual nor others can understand or control. When Gregor wakes up as an insect, the question immediately arises whether he is still the same person in a different body or has become someone entirely different. His retention of human consciousness and memory suggests continuity, but his inability to communicate or function in human society suggests radical discontinuity. This ambiguity reflects broader questions about what makes us who we are and whether personal identity depends more on physical embodiment, psychological continuity, social recognition, or some combination of factors that may not remain stable over time. The social construction of identity appears throughout Kafka's work as both necessary for human functioning and potentially oppressive to authentic self-development. Other people's expectations and perceptions shape how we see ourselves in ways we may not consciously recognize or choose. We become who others expect us to be, partly because social interaction requires some level of predictability and consistency that makes authentic spontaneity difficult to maintain. This social shaping of identity can provide useful structure and guidance, but it can also trap people in roles that no longer fit their developing sense of themselves or prevent them from exploring aspects of their personality that do not conform to social expectations. The relationship between public and private identity creates ongoing tensions for characters who must present socially acceptable versions of themselves while harboring inner experiences that may be quite different. The gap between how people appear to others and how they experience themselves internally can become a source of chronic stress and inauthenticity. This split between public persona and private experience makes genuine intimacy difficult, because people cannot be certain whether others are responding to their authentic selves or to the social masks they have learned to wear. The multiplication of social roles in complex modern societies creates additional complications as people struggle to integrate different and sometimes conflicting aspects of their identity into coherent personal narratives. Kafka explores how institutional processes can reshape personal identity in ways that individuals may not choose or even recognize. The legal system in the trial gradually transforms Joseph K. from a confident bank official into an anxious defendant, changing not just his circumstances but his fundamental sense of who he is and what he is capable of. This institutional power over identity operates partly through the categories and procedures that institutions use to classify and process individuals. When people are consistently treated as particular types of cases or problems, they may begin to internalize these classifications and experience themselves according to institutional rather than personal criteria. The economic dimensions of identity formation reflect how market relationships shape personal development in ways that may conflict with authentic self-realization. When survival depends on presenting marketable versions of ourselves to employers, customers, or potential partners, we may lose touch with aspects of our personality that have no commercial value. The pressure to develop saleable skills and attractive personal characteristics can lead to the neglect or suppression of qualities that might be important for personal fulfillment but are not rewarded in competitive market environments. This economic shaping of identity can create internal splits between our market selves and our authentic selves that make integrated personal development difficult to achieve. The temporal aspects of identity raise questions about whether personal continuity over time is real or merely a convenient fiction that we use to organize our experience. Kafka's characters often feel disconnected from their past selves and uncertain about their future development in ways that make long-term planning and commitment problematic. The person who made important decisions yesterday may feel like a stranger today, raising questions about moral responsibility and personal accountability that cannot be easily resolved. This temporal discontinuity of identity reflects broader modern experiences of rapid change and social mobility that make traditional notions of stable character and fixed personality seem increasingly outdated. The search for authentic self-knowledge becomes complicated by the possibility that there may be no fixed authentic self to discover beneath the various roles and adaptations that social life requires. Instead of having essential identities that we can uncover through introspection, we may be constantly creating ourselves through our choices and responses to circumstances beyond our control. This view of identity as ongoing creation rather than fixed discovery can be either liberating or terrifying, depending on whether we feel capable of taking responsibility for who we are becoming. The burden of creating ourselves without clear guidelines or reliable criteria for success can lead to chronic uncertainty and anxiety about whether we are developing in worthwhile directions. Kafka suggests that the demand for self-knowledge may itself be problematic because it assumes that clear and comprehensive self-understanding is both possible and desirable. The attempt to know ourselves completely may interfere with spontaneous action and authentic response to immediate circumstances. Excessive self-consciousness can become a form of paralysis that prevents engagement with life while creating the illusion of deep self-awareness. The goal might be not perfect self-knowledge, but sufficient self-acceptance to allow for authentic action despite ongoing uncertainty about our own nature and motivations. The relationship between individual identity and cultural identity creates additional complications for people who find themselves between different cultural worlds or value systems. Kafka's own experience as a German-speaking Jew in Prague provided direct insight into how cultural marginality can create identity conflicts that cannot be resolved through simple choices about affiliation or belonging. People who do not fit neatly into established cultural categories may experience chronic uncertainty about where they belong and what values should guide their choices. This cultural displacement can be either a source of creative possibility that allows for new forms of identity development or a source of chronic alienation that makes stable identity formation impossible. The philosophical implications of Kafka's treatment of identity suggest that the modern emphasis on self-knowledge and personal authenticity may need to be balanced with acceptance of uncertainty and change as permanent features of human existence. Rather than seeking to discover our true selves, we might focus on learning to live creatively with the ongoing process of becoming whoever we are in the process of becoming. This requires developing comfort with ambiguity and tolerance for the anxiety that comes with recognizing that we cannot fully control or predict our own development. The goal shifts from achieving stable identity to maintaining integrity and authenticity within the inevitable flux and uncertainty that characterize all human experience. Part 20. Power and Powerlessness. Power in Kafka's world operates through mysterious and largely invisible mechanisms that make resistance difficult and often impossible to organize effectively. Characters find themselves subject to forces they cannot understand, controlled by authorities they cannot locate, and trapped within systems whose rules remain hidden or constantly changing. This reflects Kafka's understanding that modern power operates less through direct coercion than through the creation of institutional structures that make certain forms of thinking and acting seem natural and inevitable, while making alternatives appear impossible or unthinkable. The most effective forms of power are those that people do not recognize as power because they have been internalized as common sense or personal choice. The powerlessness experienced by Kafka's characters is not simply a matter of lacking formal authority or institutional position, but a more fundamental incapacity to understand their situation well enough to respond effectively. Joseph K. in the trial cannot defend himself adequately because he is never allowed to understand what he is accused of or how the legal system operates. This strategic withholding of information makes resistance impossible by preventing people from developing accurate assessments of their circumstances or realistic strategies for improving their situation. Knowledge becomes a form of power that is carefully controlled and distributed according to hierarchical principles that serve those who already possess authority rather than those who need information to protect their interests. The bureaucratic organization of modern power creates particular problems because it diffuses responsibility throughout complex institutional structures that make accountability nearly impossible to establish. When something goes wrong, no individual can be held responsible because everyone was simply following procedures established by someone else at some other time for reasons that may no longer be relevant or comprehensible. This diffusion of responsibility protects those who exercise power while leaving those subject to power without effective recourse when institutions fail to serve their legitimate needs. The system becomes accountable to itself rather than to the people it supposedly serves, creating self-perpetuating cycles of institutional power that resist external criticism or internal reform. Kafka shows how power operates through the manipulation of basic human needs and emotions rather than relying primarily on force or explicit threats. The promise of security, acceptance, success or love can be used to control behavior more effectively than punishment because people voluntarily participate in their own subordination when they believe it serves their interests. This voluntary submission makes resistance psychologically difficult because it requires people to admit that they have been complicit in systems that do not serve their authentic needs. The shame and self-blame that accompany this recognition can be more effective than external sanctions in preventing organized opposition to unjust arrangements. The relationship between power and knowledge creates additional complications because those who possess information may use it to maintain their advantages rather than to promote general understanding or social welfare. Experts, professionals and technical specialists develop forms of specialized knowledge that make them indispensable while also making their activities difficult for ordinary people to evaluate or control. This technical complexity can be used to justify arrangements that serve professional interests rather than public needs, creating new forms of class division based on access to specialized information rather than traditional forms of wealth or inherited status. The democratization of education that promises to reduce these inequalities may actually create new forms of hierarchy based on credentials and technical expertise. The spatial organization of power receives particular attention in Kafka's work through his depictions of institutional architecture and geography that reinforce hierarchical relationships. The castle that K cannot reach, the court offices hidden in tenement attics, and the bureaucratic spaces that seem to extend infinitely, all represent how physical space can be organized to maintain and symbolize power relationships. People are kept in their place literally as well as figuratively through architectural arrangements that make some spaces accessible and others forbidden, some positions visible and others hidden. The geography of power shapes daily experience in ways that reinforce social hierarchies and make alternative arrangements difficult to imagine or implement. The temporal dimensions of power involve the capacity to control schedules, deadlines, and the pace of activities in ways that serve institutional rather than individual needs. Those who can make others wait, who control access to resources and opportunities, and who set the timing for important decisions possess significant power over the lives of those who must adapt to externally imposed schedules. The commodification of time transforms duration from a medium of human experience into a resource that can be bought and sold, creating new forms of inequality based on differential access to temporal autonomy. The acceleration of modern life often serves those who benefit from rapid change, while disadvantaging those who need time to understand and adapt to new circumstances. Kafka explores how resistance to power can be incorporated and neutralized by the very systems it seeks to challenge. Institutions may encourage limited forms of criticism and opposition that provide outlets for dissatisfaction while not threatening fundamental arrangements. The appearance of democratic participation and open debate can mask the reality that important decisions are made elsewhere by people who are not subject to public influence or control. This incorporation of resistance makes authentic opposition more difficult because it requires distinguishing between meaningful and meaningless forms of political activity, between reforms that address real problems and those that merely provide the illusion of change. The psychological effects of powerlessness extend far beyond immediate political and economic concerns to encompass fundamental questions about human agency and dignity. People who consistently find themselves unable to influence the conditions of their lives may develop learned helplessness that prevents them from recognizing and acting on opportunities for authentic agency when they do arise. This psychological adaptation to powerlessness can become self-perpetuating as people internalize low expectations about their capacity for effective action and meaningful influence. The restoration of genuine political and social agency requires not just changes in external circumstances but also psychological healing from the effects of prolonged powerlessness. Yet Kafka also suggests that power is never total, and that possibilities for authentic resistance always remain available to those willing to accept the risks and costs involved. The very complexity and instability of modern power systems create cracks and contradictions that can be exploited by people who understand how these systems actually operate. Individual acts of resistance may seem futile when viewed in isolation, but they can contribute to larger patterns of change when combined with similar acts by others who refuse to accept unjust arrangements. The goal is not to eliminate all forms of power and authority, but to ensure that power serves human needs, rather than reducing people to mere functions within inhuman systems. Part 21. Freedom and Determinism. The tension between human freedom and the forces that seem to determine our lives runs throughout Kafka's work as one of the most profound and troubling aspects of modern existence. Characters believe they are making free choices about their actions and directions, yet they consistently find themselves trapped in situations they never chose and cannot escape. This paradox suggests that freedom may be largely illusory, a comforting story we tell ourselves while actually being controlled by forces we do not understand and cannot influence. Yet the very experience of feeling trapped implies some awareness of what genuine freedom might look like, creating a persistent tension between our aspirations for autonomy and the reality of our limitations. Kafka understood that modern industrial society creates new forms of determinism that are less visible but potentially more powerful than traditional forms of external coercion. Economic pressures, social expectations, psychological conditioning, and institutional structures combine to channel human behavior in predictable directions while maintaining the appearance of individual choice. People may feel free because they can choose between different options, but these options are often predetermined by forces beyond their control and may not include the possibilities they would most genuinely prefer. This manufactured freedom serves the needs of systems that require voluntary compliance while limiting real alternatives to existing arrangements. The psychological dimensions of freedom and determinism involve the complex ways that past experiences shape present choices without completely eliminating the possibility of different responses. Characters in Kafka's stories often find themselves repeating patterns established in childhood or previous relationships, unable to break free from behavioral habits that no longer serve their authentic interests. This psychological determinism operates through unconscious mechanisms that influence behavior without being directly accessible to conscious awareness or rational control. The promise of psychological insight and therapeutic intervention suggests possibilities for greater freedom, but Kafka remains skeptical about whether self-knowledge alone is sufficient to overcome deeply ingrained patterns of thought and action. The role of character and personality in determining behavior creates additional complications for understanding the nature of human freedom. We like to think that our choices reflect our authentic values and conscious intentions, but Kafka shows how much of what we do seems to flow automatically from personality traits and character patterns we did not choose and may not fully understand. The question arises whether we are responsible for actions that emerge from aspects of our personality that we inherited rather than created, and whether genuine freedom requires the impossible task of transcending our own character. This suggests that freedom may be more limited and qualified than we typically assume, constrained by psychological factors that operate below the level of conscious choice. Social and cultural determinism operate through the transmission of values, beliefs, and behavioral patterns that shape individual development in ways that people may not recognize or question. We learn what to want, how to think, and what to value through socialization processes that begin before we have the capacity for critical reflection and continue throughout our lives through institutional and peer influences. This cultural programming can be so thorough that what feels like personal preference may actually reflect successful internalization of socially approved attitudes and desires. The challenge of achieving authentic freedom requires learning to distinguish between genuinely personal values and those we have absorbed from our social environment without conscious examination. Economic determinism appears in Kafka's work through the ways that financial necessity constrains choices and shapes life possibilities in directions that may conflict with authentic personal development. The need to earn money to survive forces people into occupational roles and economic relationships that they would not choose if survival were guaranteed through other means. This economic coercion creates a form of structural unfreedom that affects not just immediate behavior, but long-term life planning and identity development. When basic security depends on meeting external economic requirements, the development of authentic personal preferences and the pursuit of intrinsic goals become secondary considerations that may be indefinitely postponed. Kafka explores how institutional structures create systematic constraints on freedom while maintaining the rhetoric of choice and individual responsibility. Legal systems, educational institutions, healthcare organizations, and government agencies establish procedural requirements that effectively limit the range of possible actions while claiming to protect individual rights and promote social welfare. These institutional constraints operate through the multiplication of rules and requirements that make some forms of behavior practically impossible while channeling action into predetermined pathways. The complexity of institutional requirements means that compliance becomes a full-time occupation that leaves little energy or attention for pursuing authentic personal goals or challenging existing arrangements. The temporal aspects of freedom and determinism involve questions about whether the future is open to genuine alternatives or whether current trends and patterns make some outcomes inevitable regardless of individual choices. Characters in Kafka's stories often feel that they are moving toward predetermined destinies that they cannot avoid despite their awareness and resistance. This sense of fatalism may reflect accurate perception of how powerful social and psychological forces constrain individual agency, or it may represent a form of learned helplessness that prevents recognition of authentic opportunities for meaningful choice. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between realistic acceptance of limitations and premature surrender of agency that could still be exercised effectively. Yet Kafka also suggests that absolute determinism may be as illusory as absolute freedom, and that human experience involves ongoing negotiation between constraining forces and possibilities for authentic choice. Even within severely limited circumstances, people retain some capacity for choosing how to respond to their situation and what meaning to find in their experience. This residual freedom may be small in scope, but enormous in significance because it represents the irreducible core of human dignity and moral responsibility. The recognition that we cannot control most of what happens to us may paradoxically increase our appreciation for those areas where genuine choice remains possible. The creative and artistic dimensions of freedom appear in Kafka's own relationship to writing as both an expression of autonomous choice and a compulsive activity that he felt powerless to control or abandon. The artistic impulse seems to emerge from sources deeper than conscious intention, yet it also represents one of the most authentic forms of human freedom through its capacity to create new possibilities and alternative ways of understanding experience. This suggests that freedom may be less about controlling circumstances than about finding authentic ways to respond creatively to whatever circumstances we encounter. The goal shifts from achieving complete autonomy to discovering forms of meaningful agency that remain possible within the constraints that characterize all human existence. The philosophical implications of Kafka's treatment of freedom and determinism point toward a nuanced understanding that avoids both naive belief in unlimited freedom and paralyzing conviction that nothing we do matters. This middle path requires developing realistic assessment of our actual capacities and limitations while maintaining commitment to exercising whatever authentic choice remains available to us. The value of freedom may lie not in its extent, but in its quality, not in the range of options we possess, but in the authenticity with which we choose among the options that actually exist. This qualified freedom demands more wisdom and courage than absolute freedom would require, because it must be exercised without guarantees and maintained despite ongoing uncertainty about its effectiveness and significance. Part 22. The Grotesque and the Surreal. The grotesque and surreal elements in Kafka's work serve not as fantasy or escape from reality, but as literal presentations of the hidden truth about modern existence that normally remains disguised beneath the surface of ordinary social interactions. When Gregor Samsa wakes up as an insect, when Joseph K. is arrested for an unknown crime, when K. cannot reach the castle that employs him, these events reveal the actual logic of social relationships that usually operates in less visible ways. The grotesque makes visible the dehumanization, arbitrariness, and fundamental absurdity that characterize normal institutional life, but are typically hidden by familiar routines and social conventions. What appears surreal is actually more realistic than conventional realism because it strips away the comforting illusions that prevent us from seeing how strange and disturbing our ordinary existence really is. The transformation of human beings into non-human forms reflects Kafka's understanding that modern social and economic systems systematically reduce people to functions, categories and instrumental utilities rather than recognizing their full humanity. Gregor's metamorphosis into an insect literalizes the way that capitalism transforms workers into interchangeable parts within productive machinery. His family's treatment of him after the transformation reveals that they had never really seen him as a full person, but only as a source of financial support. The grotesque physical change makes visible the psychological and social dehumanization that was already present but hidden beneath the appearances of normal family relationships. Kafka's use of animal imagery throughout his work serves to highlight the ways that human beings are reduced to biological and economic functions, while their distinctively human capacities for creativity, moral choice and spiritual development are ignored or suppressed. People become like animals not because they are inherently bestial, but because social systems treat them as if their animal needs and capacities were all that mattered. The grotesque animal transformations represent the logical endpoint of social processes that progressively strip away human dignity and reduce persons to mere organisms seeking survival and basic gratification. This animalization serves the interests of systems that benefit from treating people as predictable and manageable resources, rather than unpredictable and autonomous agents. The surreal distortions of space and time in Kafka's narratives reflect the actual experience of living within institutional systems that operate according to their own internal logic, rather than human needs or natural rhythms. The endless corridors, hidden offices and inaccessible authorities represent the maze-like quality of bureaucratic structures that people must navigate without adequate maps or reliable guides. The temporal distortions where processes drag on indefinitely or events happen without warning mirror the way that institutional time ignores individual psychological and biological rhythms. These apparently surreal elements accurately capture the disorienting experience of trying to live humanly within inhuman organizational structures. The grotesque often emerges in Kafka's work through the exaggeration of normal social dynamics to the point where their underlying logic becomes impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The extreme nature of Joseph K.'s legal situation in the trial makes visible the arbitrary and self-serving character of all legal systems, while the total transformation in the Metamorphosis reveals the conditional and instrumental nature of family love. By pushing ordinary situations to their logical extremes, Kafka shows us what these situations really involve when stripped of the softening effects of habit, social convention, and wishful thinking. The grotesque serves as a form of social criticism that is more penetrating than realistic description because it reveals essential patterns that realistic representation might leave hidden. The relationship between the grotesque and comedy appears throughout Kafka's work in ways that create uncomfortable laughter rather than simple amusement. The absurd situations his characters find themselves in are simultaneously tragic and comic, evoking responses that combine sympathy with recognition of the ridiculous aspects of human pretension and self-deception. This dark humour serves not to provide relief from serious concerns, but to intensify awareness of how strange and arbitrary much of what we take seriously really is. The laughter that Kafka's work provokes is often tinged with recognition and discomfort because it reveals uncomfortable truths about our own participation in absurd social arrangements. The surreal elements in Kafka's narratives often involve the breakdown of normal cause and effect relationships, creating worlds where actions do not produce expected consequences, and where effects seem unrelated to any discernible causes. This reflects the actual experience of living within complex modern systems where individual actions have unpredictable consequences and where outcomes often seem unrelated to individual merit, effort, or intention. The apparently surreal nature of these relationships accurately captures how incomprehensible and uncontrollable much of modern life has become for ordinary individuals. What seems fantastical is actually a realistic representation of how mysterious and arbitrary social and economic forces have become in contemporary society. The grotesque body appears in Kafka's work as a symbol of how modern conditions affect human physical and psychological integrity. Characters experience their own bodies as foreign, unreliable, or disgusting, reflecting broader alienation from natural processes and biological rhythms. The emphasis on illness, physical discomfort, and bodily transformation suggests that the split between mind and body, characteristic of modern culture, creates forms of self-estrangement that affect the most basic levels of human experience. The grotesque body becomes a site where social and psychological conflicts are literally embodied in ways that cannot be ignored or intellectualized away. Kafka's treatment of technology and machinery often involves surreal distortions that reveal the ways that supposedly helpful devices and systems actually control and diminish the people they claim to serve. The execution machine in the Penal Colony represents the ultimate technological solution to human problems, eliminating the need for human judgment, mercy, or individual consideration. This mechanical perfection reveals the inhumane logic that underlies technological approaches to social and moral problems. The surreal efficiency of the machine makes visible the actual character of systems that subordinate human needs to technical requirements and administrative convenience. The dreamlike quality that pervades much of Kafka's work reflects his understanding that the boundary between waking consciousness and unconscious psychological processes has become blurred in modern conditions. Characters often seem to be sleepwalking through situations that require alert response, while their unconscious fears and desires shape external events in ways that seem to violate realistic causation. This blurring of psychological and external reality suggests that the inner lives of individuals and the outer structures of society are more intimately connected than conventional distinctions between subjective and objective reality would suggest. The surreal becomes a way of representing psychological truth that cannot be captured through purely external description of social conditions. The philosophical significance of the grotesque and surreal in Kafka's work lies in their capacity to defamiliarize ordinary experience and make visible aspects of reality that habit and convention normally keep hidden. By presenting familiar situations in unfamiliar forms, Kafka forces readers to see their own circumstances with fresh eyes and to recognize patterns they might otherwise take for granted. The grotesque becomes a tool for critical consciousness, a way of breaking through the normalizing effects of routine and social conditioning to achieve clearer perception of actual conditions. The goal is not to provide escape from reality, but to reveal reality more completely by stripping away the comfortable illusions that prevent authentic understanding and appropriate response to contemporary circumstances. Part 23. Modern Life and Dehumanization. Kafka's exploration of modern life reveals systematic processes of dehumanization that reduce individuals to functional units within larger mechanical and administrative systems. The promise of modernity, that technological progress and rational organization would improve human life, proves to be largely false, as these developments create new forms of alienation and control that may be more subtle but also more pervasive than traditional forms of oppression. Characters find themselves trapped within systems designed for efficiency and predictability rather than human flourishing, forced to adapt themselves to mechanical requirements rather than having technology serve human needs. This reversal of the proper relationship between people and systems becomes so complete that the systems appear natural and inevitable, while human needs seem unrealistic and problematic. The mechanization of human relationships appears throughout Kafka's work as people learn to interact with each other according to prescribed roles and procedures, rather than responding spontaneously to individual personalities and circumstances. Family members, co-workers and even lovers begin to treat each other as if they were machines designed to perform specific functions rather than complex persons with unpredictable inner lives. This mechanization makes relationships more predictable and manageable, but eliminates the spontaneity, creativity and genuine intimacy that give human connection its distinctive value. People become lonely even within relationships because they are relating to social roles rather than authentic persons, creating isolation in the midst of apparent connection. The standardization of experience through mass media, consumer culture and institutional procedures creates environments where individual differences are minimized and personal uniqueness becomes problematic rather than valuable. People learn to want the same things, think in similar ways, and express themselves through standardized forms and formats that make mass administration possible, but individual expression difficult. This standardization serves the needs of systems that must process large numbers of people efficiently, but it reduces the rich diversity of human personality and cultural expression to manageable categories. The celebration of individuality in modern culture often turns out to be merely the freedom to choose among predetermined options, rather than the opportunity to develop authentic personal characteristics and values. The acceleration of modern life creates temporal pressures that prevent the kind of reflection, contemplation and gradual development that genuine human flourishing requires. People are constantly pressured to respond quickly to changing circumstances, make rapid decisions without adequate information, and adapt continuously to new requirements and expectations. This acceleration serves economic systems that benefit from rapid turnover and constant change, but it undermines the slower rhythms of psychological development, relationship building, and cultural creation. The speed of modern life becomes a form of violence against human nature, preventing the kind of depth and stability that allow for meaningful experience and authentic growth. The bureaucratization of daily life extends institutional logic into areas of experience that were previously governed by personal judgment, community traditions, or informal social arrangements. Education, healthcare, family relationships, and even leisure activities become subject to administrative procedures that prioritize efficiency and control over individual needs and preferences. This expansion of bureaucratic logic transforms citizens into clients, students into cases, and patients into problems to be processed according to standardized protocols. The human capacity for individual judgment and creative response atrophies when people become accustomed to following procedures rather than thinking for themselves about what their particular circumstances require. The commodification of human activity transforms experiences that were previously valued for their intrinsic worth into products that must be bought and sold in market relationships. Education becomes a commodity purchased to increase earning potential rather than a process of intellectual and moral development. Healthcare becomes a product sold to consumers rather than a caring relationship between healers and patients. Even personal relationships and family life become subject to market logic, as people calculate the costs and benefits of emotional investments and seek to maximize their returns from social interactions. The fragmentation of modern life creates artificial divisions between different aspects of human experience that were previously integrated in more holistic ways of living. Work life becomes separated from family life, rational thought from emotional response, individual needs from community obligations, creating internal splits that make authentic living difficult. People must constantly shift between different roles and contexts that may require incompatible values and behaviors, making consistent moral character and coherent personal identity problematic. This fragmentation serves systems that benefit from having people focus on narrow, specialized functions, but it undermines the integration and wholeness that human psychology requires for health and satisfaction. The surveillance capabilities of modern institutions create environments where privacy and autonomous thought become increasingly difficult to maintain. People modify their behavior not only when they know they are being watched, but also when they simply suspect that surveillance is possible. This anticipatory conformity affects not just external actions, but also internal thought processes as people learn to monitor and censor their own thoughts according to external standards. The internalization of surveillance creates forms of self-control that are more effective than external monitoring because they operate continuously and require no institutional resources to maintain. The complexity of modern systems makes it increasingly difficult for ordinary people to understand how the institutions that govern their lives actually operate, or what alternatives might be possible. This systematic opacity serves those who benefit from existing arrangements by making informed criticism and effective resistance more difficult to organize. When people cannot understand how systems work, they cannot effectively challenge those systems or propose realistic alternatives. Ignorance becomes a form of powerlessness that maintains existing hierarchies and prevents the kind of democratic participation that might lead to more humane arrangements. The psychological effects of dehumanization extend beyond immediate social and economic concerns to affect the most basic levels of human self-understanding and emotional capacity. People who are consistently treated as functions rather than persons may begin to experience themselves as less than fully human, losing confidence in their own perceptions, feelings, and moral judgments. This psychological diminishment becomes self-perpetuating as people adapt to dehumanizing conditions by developing defensive strategies that further reduce their capacity for authentic human response. The restoration of genuine humanity requires not just changes in external circumstances, but also psychological healing from the effects of systematic dehumanization. Yet, Kafka also suggests that awareness of dehumanizing processes may be the first step toward resisting them and developing more humane alternatives. When people recognize how systems diminish their humanity, they may be motivated to seek relationships and activities that honor their full human potential. This resistance may begin at the individual level with personal choices about how to live and relate to others, but it ultimately requires collective action to create institutional structures that serve human needs rather than reducing people to instrumental functions. The goal is not to eliminate all systems and organizations, but to ensure that they enhance, rather than diminish, the possibilities for authentic human development and meaningful social relationship. Part 24. Jewish Identity and Cultural Displacement. Kafka's experience as a German-speaking Jew in Prague placed him at the intersection of multiple cultural worlds while belonging fully to none of them, creating a perspective of permanent marginality that profoundly influenced his understanding of modern identity and alienation. He lived simultaneously as a member of the German-speaking minority within Czech-dominated Prague, a Jew within predominantly Christian Central Europe, and a modernizing intellectual within traditional Jewish family structures. This multiple displacement provided him with unique insight into how cultural identity becomes problematic in modern multicultural societies where traditional boundaries have been disrupted but new forms of belonging have not emerged to replace them. The Jewish experience of historical displacement and cultural adaptation became a lens through which Kafka examined broader modern experiences of rootlessness and alienation. The relationship between Kafka's Jewish heritage and his literary work remains complex and contested, partly because he deliberately avoided explicit Jewish themes and characters in most of his writing. Yet critics have identified distinctively Jewish elements in his treatment of guilt, law, interpretation, and the search for meaning within apparently meaningless circumstances. The Jewish tradition of textual interpretation and commentary may have influenced his approach to narrative as an ongoing process of questioning rather than a vehicle for providing definitive answers. The Jewish experience of living within but apart from dominant Christian culture parallels the situation of many of his characters, who find themselves simultaneously inside and outside the social systems that govern their lives. Kafka's father, Hermann, represented one strategy for dealing with Jewish identity in modern circumstances: assimilation into the dominant culture through commercial success and the adoption of bourgeois values and lifestyle. This approach involved minimizing Jewish religious practice and cultural distinctiveness while maintaining primarily social and business connections to the Jewish community. Franz found this strategy unsatisfying because it seemed to involve the sacrifice of authentic cultural identity without providing genuine acceptance into the dominant culture. The price of assimilation appeared to be the loss of any distinctive identity or cultural tradition while achieving only superficial integration into a society that would always regard Jews as fundamentally different and potentially threatening. The alternative of Zionism and Jewish nationalism attracted Kafka at various points in his life, but ultimately failed to provide a satisfactory resolution to his identity conflicts. He was fascinated by the possibility of Jewish cultural renewal and the creation of authentic Jewish community in Palestine, but he remained skeptical about nationalist solutions to cultural problems. The Zionist emphasis on normalizing the Jewish condition by creating a Jewish state seemed to miss the potentially valuable aspects of Jewish marginality and cultural difference. Kafka appeared to believe that the Jewish experience of displacement and cultural boundary crossing might have universal significance for understanding modern conditions rather than being simply a problem to be solved through territorial nationalism. The linguistic dimensions of Jewish identity created particular complications for Kafka as a writer who chose to express himself in German rather than Czech, Hebrew, or Yiddish. German was both the language of high culture and literature that he admired and the language of the dominant minority within the Austro-Hungarian Empire that often excluded or marginalized Jews. This linguistic choice reflected broader dilemmas about cultural allegiance and authentic expression that faced many Jewish intellectuals in Central Europe. Writing in German allowed access to a sophisticated literary tradition, but also raised questions about whether authentic Jewish experience could be adequately expressed in the language of a culture that had historically oppressed Jews. Kafka's treatment of father-son relationships reflects distinctively Jewish patterns of generational conflict, involving questions about religious tradition, cultural identity, and social integration. The tension between Hermann's practical assimilationism and Franz's intellectual and artistic pursuits paralleled broader conflicts between traditional Jewish religious culture and modern secular society. Franz felt guilty about abandoning traditional Jewish religious practice, but also unable to embrace it authentically, creating the kind of spiritual homelessness that appears throughout his literary work. This generational conflict involved not just personal family dynamics, but broader questions about how to maintain meaningful cultural identity within rapidly changing social circumstances. The theme of chosenness and exile that runs through Jewish religious and cultural tradition appears in transformed form throughout Kafka's exploration of characters who feel selected for special treatment by mysterious authorities. Joseph K.'s arrest for an unknown crime parallels the Jewish experience of being singled out for persecution without clear justification or means of defense. The sense of being both chosen and excluded, special and marginal, reflects the ambiguous position of Jews within Christian European society. This double consciousness of being simultaneously inside and outside dominant cultural narratives provided Kafka with insight into broader modern experiences of alienation and cultural displacement. The question of Jewish guilt and responsibility appears in Kafka's work through his exploration of characters who feel guilty without clear cause and responsible for situations beyond their control. The Christian tradition of original sin and individual moral responsibility intersected with Jewish traditions of collective responsibility and historical consciousness in ways that intensified feelings of guilt and moral burden. Characters in Kafka's stories often feel accountable not just for their own actions, but for broader patterns of injustice and suffering that they did not directly cause, but from which they may have indirectly benefited. This expanded sense of moral responsibility reflects both Jewish ethical traditions and the particular situation of minority groups who must navigate complex relationships with dominant cultures. The role of interpretation and meaning-making in Jewish cultural tradition influenced Kafka's approach to narrative as an ongoing process of questioning rather than a means of providing definitive explanations. The Jewish practice of commentary and debate around sacred texts created expectations that important writings should generate multiple interpretations rather than single clear meanings. This interpretive tradition may have shaped Kafka's preference for ambiguous narratives that resist simple explanation and continue to provoke new readings and understandings. The open-endedness of much Jewish textual interpretation parallels the inconclusive nature of many of Kafka's stories and their resistance to definitive critical analysis. The broader implications of Kafka's treatment of Jewish identity extend beyond questions of ethnic or religious identity to encompass general problems of cultural belonging in modern pluralistic societies. The Jewish experience of cultural displacement and boundary crossing prefigures similar experiences that have become more common as traditional cultural boundaries have weakened and populations have become more mobile. The creative possibilities and psychological difficulties that Kafka experienced as a result of his multicultural situation anticipate challenges that many people now face in navigating complex cultural identities. His exploration of Jewish marginality provides insight into how cultural displacement can become either a source of creative possibility or psychological suffering, depending on how individuals and societies respond to the challenges of multicultural existence. Part 25. Art and the Creative Process. For Kafka, writing functioned as both a form of salvation and a source of torment, offering the possibility of authentic self-expression while also revealing the fundamental inadequacy of all human attempts to communicate truth or create lasting meaning. He described writing as a form of prayer, suggesting that the creative process served spiritual and psychological needs that could not be met through conventional religious or social activities. Yet this prayer often went unanswered, leaving him with a sense of failure and incompleteness that intensified rather than resolved his existential struggles. The very activity that promised to provide meaning and connection often increased his awareness of isolation and the impossibility of truly sharing his inner experience with others. The relationship between art and life in Kafka's experience involved ongoing tensions between the demands of creative work and the requirements of ordinary social and professional existence. Writing required solitude, concentration, and emotional intensity that conflicted with the need to maintain relationships, earn money, and fulfill social obligations. This conflict was not simply a matter of time management, but reflected deeper incompatibilities between the authentic self that emerged in creative work and the social self that was necessary for functioning in everyday circumstances. The artist's need for independence and autonomy often conflicted with basic human needs for connection, security, and social recognition that could not be satisfied through creative work alone. Kafka's approach to narrative technique reflected his philosophical understanding that truth cannot be stated directly but must be approached indirectly through suggestion, metaphor, and the creation of experiences that readers must interpret for themselves. His stories resist simple explanation or moral instruction, instead creating situations that force readers to confront fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and moral responsibility. This indirect approach to truth-telling reflects his belief that authentic insight cannot be transmitted like information, but must be discovered through each person's individual engagement with complex and ambiguous experience. The goal of art is not to provide answers, but to create conditions for questioning that might lead to authentic understanding. The fragmentary and often unfinished nature of Kafka's major works reflects both practical circumstances and deeper philosophical convictions about the nature of artistic creation. The demands of his professional work and his struggles with illness left limited time and energy for sustained creative effort. But the incompleteness of his novels also suggests skepticism about whether any artistic work could adequately capture the complexity of human experience. The very attempt to create finished and complete artistic statements might violate the open-ended and uncertain character of existence itself. Leaving works unfinished preserves their capacity to generate ongoing interpretation and response rather than closing them off through premature resolution. The theme of artistic failure appears throughout Kafka's exploration of characters who attempt to communicate or create, but find their efforts misunderstood, ignored, or actively resisted by others. The hunger artist who starves himself as a form of performance. Art discovers that his audience has lost interest in his extreme dedication and self-sacrifice. The trapeze artist and other performers in Kafka's stories represent the broader situation of artists who depend on public recognition and support, but find themselves increasingly isolated from audiences who cannot or will not appreciate their work. This artistic isolation mirrors broader modern experiences of alienation and communication failure, while raising specific questions about the social function and value of creative activity. Kafka understood that artistic creation involves both conscious craft and unconscious processes that cannot be directly controlled or predicted by the artist. The most powerful moments in creative work often emerge spontaneously from sources deeper than rational intention, making the artist partly a recipient rather than simply a creator of the work that emerges. This lack of complete control over the creative process creates both excitement and anxiety for artists who cannot guarantee that inspiration will continue or that their efforts will result in meaningful achievement. The dependence on unconscious processes makes artistic work inherently uncertain and vulnerable to forces beyond the artist's conscious direction or influence. The relationship between artistic creation and personal psychology in Kafka's work suggests that art emerges from and potentially transforms the psychological conflicts and struggles that motivate creative activity. Writing served as a way of exploring and potentially resolving personal anxieties and obsessions, but it also risked intensifying these problems by focusing sustained attention on troubling themes and experiences. The therapeutic potential of creative expression must be balanced against the possibility that artistic exploration of psychological problems might deepen rather than resolve them. Art becomes both a symptom of psychological disturbance and a potential means of transcending or transforming that disturbance through creative expression. Kafka's treatment of the artist's relationship to society reflects broader tensions between individual creativity and social conformity that characterize modern cultural conditions. Artists need social support and recognition to sustain their work, but they also require independence from social expectations and market pressures that might corrupt their artistic vision. This creates ongoing dilemmas about how to maintain artistic integrity while achieving the practical success necessary for continued creative activity. The commercialization of culture in modern societies makes these dilemmas more acute by subjecting artistic work to market forces that may have little connection to genuine aesthetic or spiritual values. The question of artistic legacy and the survival of creative work beyond the artist's death appears in Kafka's instructions that his major works be destroyed after his death. This request reflects both personal modesty and deeper questions about whether artistic achievements can maintain their authentic meaning when separated from the living context of their creation. The transformation of personal creative expression into cultural commodities available for academic study and commercial exploitation may violate the original spirit and intention of the work. Yet the preservation of Kafka's writings against his explicit wishes suggests that creative works develop their own independent existence that transcends the artist's intentions and continues to generate meaning for new audiences and circumstances. The universality of Kafka's artistic vision emerges from his ability to transform highly personal psychological and cultural experiences into narratives that speak to broader human concerns about meaning, identity, and moral responsibility. The specificity of his Central European Jewish experience becomes a lens through which universal themes of alienation, displacement, and the search for authentic existence can be explored and understood. This suggests that authentic artistic creation requires deep engagement with particular circumstances and personal experience, rather than attempts to address universal themes directly. The most universal artistic statements often emerge from the most specific and personal explorations of individual experience and local cultural conditions. The philosophical significance of Kafka's approach to art lies in his demonstration that creative activity can serve as a form of philosophical inquiry that explores fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and value through imaginative rather than purely rational means. Literature becomes a way of thinking about philosophical problems that rational analysis alone cannot adequately address. creating experiential knowledge that complements and sometimes challenges purely intellectual approaches to understanding. The value of artistic creation may lie not in its capacity to solve philosophical problems, but in its ability to keep important questions alive and present to consciousness in ways that prevent premature closure or false resolution. Art serves truth, not by providing answers, but by maintaining authentic engagement with the mystery and complexity of human existence.